1. The deadly illusion why becoming a nun wasn't the safe haven you think. When we think of medieval nuns, we imagine peaceful women praying quietly in safe monastery walls, spending their days in gentle contemplation and charitable works. These romanticized images show us serene figures gliding through clustered gardens, their white habits pristine, their faces glowing with spiritual peace. But this romantic image couldn't be further from the brutal reality that awaited women who entered religious life during the medieval period. Medieval convents were some of the most dangerous places a woman could find herself, and surviving as a nun required skills that had nothing to do with prayer and everything to do with warfare, politics, and sheer cunning. The very institutions that promised salvation and protection often became death traps where women faced threats that would terrify modern people living in war zones. The medieval world was violent and chaotic beyond modern comprehension, and nuns were frequent targets for attacks, robberies, sexual assault, and murder. Unlike the protected stereotype we imagine, convents were isolated, often wealthy institutions that attracted the attention of bandits, invading armies, and corrupt officials like magnets attract iron filings. A nun's vows of chastity and poverty made her vulnerable, not protected, creating a perfect storm of defenselessness that predators exploited ruthlessly and systematically. The harsh truth is that choosing religious life often meant trading one set of dangers for another, but the new dangers were often far worse than what women faced in secular life. While marriage brought risks of childbirth and domestic violence, convent life brought threats of invasion, starvation, systematic abuse from church officials, and internal violence from other nuns that could be just as deadly as anything faced on medieval battlefields. The very isolation that was supposed to protect religious women often left them completely defenseless when threats emerged from the darkness. Remote locations that provided spiritual solitude also meant that help could be days away when violence erupted. The high walls that were meant to keep the world out could just as easily trap victims inside when attackers gained entry. Medieval chronicles are filled with accounts of entire convents being burned down with nuns inside, their screams echoing through the night as their supposed sanctuaries became their funeral pyres. The Danish invasion of England in 870 CE saw Barking Abbey completely destroyed, with all the nuns burned alive in their own chapel while they prayed desperately for salvation that never came. The attackers reportedly barred the doors from the outside, ensuring that none of the religious women could escape the flames. The Viking raids on Irish monasteries throughout the 9th and 10th centuries specifically targeted religious women who were seen as valuable slaves and easy prey for warriors who viewed rape and murder as acceptable spoils of war. These weren't random acts of violence, but systematic campaigns designed to terrorize Christian populations and capture valuable human resources for slave markets. This wasn't just ancient history confined to the early medieval period when civilization was supposedly more primitive. The pattern continued throughout the centuries, becoming more sophisticated and systematic as time progressed and military techniques evolved. During the 100 Years' War, French convents were repeatedly attacked by English forces who viewed them as legitimate military targets because of their wealth and political connections. German convents faced similar devastation during the various wars of succession that plagued the Holy Roman Empire, with entire communities disappearing overnight when armies swept through their territories like deadly storms. The systematic nature of these attacks suggests that military commanders specifically targeted religious women as part of broader strategies to demoralize enemy populations and capture valuable resources. The psychological impact of living under constant threat cannot be understated or ignored when considering medieval religious life. Nuns lived with the knowledge that their monastery could be attacked at any moment, their sisters murdered, and their own lives destroyed without warning. Every distant sound, every rumor of approaching soldiers, every plume of smoke on the horizon would send terror through the community like wildfire spreading through dry grass. Many developed what we would now recognize as chronic anxiety disorders and post-traumatic stress symptoms that manifested in various ways throughout their religious careers. Some became hypervigilant, unable to sleep properly or relax even during peaceful periods. Others developed elaborate rituals and compulsions designed to give them some sense of control over their dangerous environment. But the external threats were only part of the story that unfolded behind the convent walls day after day, year after year. The internal politics of convent life could be just as deadly as any invading army, creating an environment where survival required political intelligence as much as religious devotion. Some nuns became masters of manipulation and intrigue that would make Machiavelli proud, developing skills in psychological warfare that they used to protect themselves and destroy their enemies. The closed nature of convent communities created pressure cooker environments where small conflicts could escalate into life-threatening situations. Women who might never have met in the outside world were forced to live together in close quarters for decades, sharing resources, responsibilities, and living spaces while competing for status, favor, and basic necessities. The most successful medieval nuns understood that survival required developing a comprehensive skill set that included military strategy, economic planning, medical knowledge, and psychological warfare techniques. They had to be warriors disguised as brides of Christ, ready to defend their communities through any means necessary, including methods that would horrify modern observers who view religious life as inherently peaceful and nonviolent. These survival skills had to be learned quickly or the consequences could be fatal. New nuns who failed to understand the dangerous realities of convent life often became victims within their first year, either through external violence, internal conflicts, or simple accidents that could have been prevented with proper knowledge and preparation. 2. The violence matrix, external threats, and military survival. Medieval nuns faced constant physical danger from external forces that viewed convents as attractive targets for multiple devastating reasons. These religious communities often contain valuable artifacts accumulated over generations, significant wealth stored in various forms, and housed defenseless women who could be easily overpowered by organized groups of attackers. Understanding and surviving these threats required developing sophisticated defense strategies that most people would never associate with religious life. Invading armies posed the greatest immediate threat to convent communities throughout the medieval period, bringing destruction on a scale that could eliminate entire regions of religious life. Vikings, Magyars, Saracens, and later various Christian armies made repeated devastating attacks on religious establishments throughout Europe, leaving trails of destruction and death that lasted for generations and reshaped the religious landscape permanently. These weren't random raids conducted by undisciplined barbarians seeking quick plunder, but systematic military campaigns designed to capture wealth, destroy rival religious institutions, and terrorize civilian populations into submission. The attackers often had specific intelligence about their targets, knowing which convents contained the most valuable treasures and which had the weakest defenses. The threat extended far beyond formal military campaigns conducted by organized national armies with clear political objectives. Small bands of renegade soldiers, military deserters, and common criminals often targeted convents during times of political instability and social chaos, when normal law enforcement had broken down and violence could occur without legal consequences. These groups were often less disciplined than formal armies and more prone to indiscriminate violence against civilians, making them particularly dangerous for religious communities that had no military training or defensive capabilities. Rogue soldiers who had deserted from legitimate armies often retained their military skills while losing any restraint that formal military discipline might have provided. Professional mercenary companies, which became increasingly common during the later medieval period, posed particular dangers to religious communities that couldn't defend themselves against trained warriors. These military contractors had no loyalty except to money, and they often supplemented their income by attacking and looting vulnerable targets like convents when their official contracts ended and they needed resources to survive between legitimate employment opportunities. The mercenaries were particularly dangerous because they combined professional military skills with complete lack of moral restraints. Unlike soldiers fighting for religious or patriotic causes, mercenaries viewed violence purely as a business transaction and had no incentive to show mercy to religious women who couldn't pay for protection. Local nobles sometimes posed threats that were just as dangerous as foreign invaders, and potentially more so because they had intimate knowledge of local conditions and defenses. Corrupt or desperate lords might attack nearby convents to seize their wealth, settle political scores, or eliminate witnesses to their other crimes. The legal protections that were supposed to shield religious communities often proved worthless when local authorities were the source of the threat. Some nobles would manufacture legal pretexts for attacking convents, claiming that the religious communities owed them money, had violated some obscure legal obligation, or were harboring enemies. These pseudo-legal attacks were particularly difficult to defend against because they had the appearance of legitimate authority behind them. Bandits and highway robbers represented another constant threat that could strike without warning and disappear before help could arrive. These criminals often operated in organized groups that could overwhelm convent defenses through superior numbers and coordination. Unlike armies that might be satisfied with plunder, bandits were often willing to kill witnesses to prevent identification and pursuit. The most dangerous bandit groups developed sophisticated intelligence networks that allowed them to time their attacks perfectly. They would know when convents received payments from benefactors, when valuable shipments were arriving, and when defensive preparations were weakest. Nuns developed various survival strategies for these external military threats, creating systems that would be recognizable to modern military strategists and security professionals. Some convents established early warning systems with local farming communities who would send rapid messengers when hostile forces were spotted in the region approaching from various directions. These networks required careful cultivation and regular maintenance to remain effective during crisis periods. Nuns had to build relationships with local farmers, merchants, and travelers who could provide intelligence about developing threats. Some communities maintained formal agreements with nearby villages, providing medical care and other services in exchange for security information. Others created elaborate hidden chambers and secret escape routes that could be activated when attacks became imminent. These underground passages, concealed storage areas, and emergency exits required significant construction expertise and ongoing maintenance, but they could mean the difference between life and death when violence erupted without warning. The most sophisticated escape systems included multiple routes to different destinations, cash supplies at various points, and communication methods for coordinating evacuations. Some convents maintained safe houses in nearby communities where nuns could hide until threats passed or help arrived. The most successful communities learned to negotiate with potential attackers, sometimes paying substantial ransoms or bribes to avoid violence altogether. This required maintaining cash reserves specifically for emergencies, developing diplomatic skills that could convince hardened warriors to spare religious communities, and understanding the psychology of military leaders who might be persuaded to show mercy. Negotiation strategies had to be carefully calibrated to avoid appearing either too wealthy, which would encourage future attacks, or too poor, which might make attackers desperate enough to use violence anyway. The most skilled negotiators could assess attackers quickly and determine what combination of payment, appeals to religious sentiment, and practical considerations might secure the community's safety. Geographic location determined much of a convent's vulnerability to military attack, with some locations being inherently more dangerous than others throughout the medieval period. Monasteries situated near major transportation routes faced constant threats from passing armies, bandits, and criminals who used the roads for their own purposes and viewed nearby religious communities as convenient targets for plunder. Those located near disputed territorial borders found themselves repeatedly caught in the crossfire of larger political conflicts that they had no power to influence or escape. Border regions were particularly dangerous because they changed hands frequently, meaning that yesterday's protectors could become today's enemies overnight. Convents in remote mountain locations faced different but equally serious dangers that required completely different survival strategies. While isolation provided some protection from large armies that preferred easier targets, it also made them attractive targets for bandits who used the remoteness to their advantage and could attack without fear of immediate intervention from outside authorities. The remoteness also meant if attacks did occur, help would be slow to arrive and attackers would have plenty of time to complete their work and escape. Some isolated convents disappeared entirely without anyone knowing what had happened to them until years later when their ruins were discovered. Weather patterns and seasonal cycles affected the timing of military campaigns and attacks in predictable ways that smart nuns learned to recognize and prepare for. Spring and summer brought increased military activity as armies could more easily travel, forage for supplies, and conduct siege operations without being hindered by harsh weather conditions. Understanding these patterns allowed religious communities to prepare defenses, hide valuables, and sometimes evacuate temporarily during the most dangerous periods. The most sophisticated communities maintained detailed records of attack patterns and used this intelligence to predict when threats were most likely to emerge. When attacks did occur, nuns had limited options for effective defense against trained warriors with superior weapons and numbers. Some historical accounts describe religious women attempting to disguise themselves as peasant farmers or hide among local civilian populations, hoping to avoid detection until the danger passed and they could return to their communities. Others tell of desperate attempts to preserve valuable religious artifacts and written manuscripts, sometimes at the cost of their own lives, when they refuse to abandon their sacred duties. Some nuns would rather die protecting their community's treasures than live to see them stolen or destroyed by hostile forces. 3. The daily survival schedule, navigating danger hour by hour. The daily routine of medieval nuns was structured around 8 religious services that began before dawn and continued until late evening, but survival required constant vigilance between these prescribed activities. Understanding this schedule and its vulnerabilities was essential for any woman hoping to survive long enough to see her religious vows fulfilled rather than becoming another casualty of the dangerous world that existed behind convent walls. A typical day started at 2:00 a.m. with Matins Laud, the first service of the day, which required nuns to navigate dark corridors where attackers might be hiding. Accidents could easily occur, and the cold could be literally deadly during winter months. The pre-dawn hours were particularly dangerous because they provided perfect cover for infiltrators who had scaled walls or hidden in the grounds during daylight hours, and the grogginess of newly awakened nuns made them vulnerable to threats they might otherwise detect and avoid. The darkness created additional hazards beyond human threats. Medieval convents were illuminated only by candles and oil lamps, creating shadows where dangers could lurk and making it easy to trip over obstacles or fall down stairs. Many nuns suffered serious injuries during these early morning movements, and some died from falls that would have been minor accidents in daylight. The cold was another serious threat during winter months, when temperatures inside stone buildings could drop to life-threatening levels. Nuns had to balance the need for warmth against the fire hazards created by additional heating sources, and some communities lost members to hypothermia when heating systems failed or fuel ran out during severe weather. After the early morning service, nuns would return to their communal sleeping quarters, but experienced survivors learned to sleep lightly and position themselves near escape routes that they had personally tested and prepared. The communal dormitories, while providing some security through numbers, also created serious vulnerabilities because a single intruder could threaten multiple women simultaneously, and diseases could spread rapidly through the shared sleeping spaces. The most security-conscious nuns developed personal sleeping arrangements that maximized the chances of survival if threats emerged during the night. They would position their beds near windows or doors that could serve as escape routes, keep weapons or defensive tools within easy reach, and establish systems for silently alerting other community members if danger appeared. Some nuns slept in shifts, with different community members maintaining watch throughout the night while others rested. This required careful coordination and discipline, but it provided early warning of threats that might otherwise catch the entire community defenseless. At first light, nuns would wash and eat breakfast consisting of bread and beer. Drinking beer was much safer than water due to the brewing process that killed dangerous bacteria, but even this simple meal required careful attention to potential poisoning attempts by enemies or rivals within the community. Every piece of food had to be examined for signs of tampering, every drink tested for unusual taste or appearance, and every meal treated as a potential threat to survival. Food poisoning was a constant danger in medieval times, when preservation techniques were primitive and contamination could occur at any stage from production to consumption. Nuns learned to recognize the signs of spoiled food, understand which preservation methods were most reliable, and identify symptoms of various types of poisoning so they could seek treatment quickly if contamination occurred. But intentional poisoning was an even more serious threat, as rivals within the community or external enemies might attempt to eliminate specific individuals or entire groups through contaminated food or drink. Some nuns developed expertise in detecting poison through smell, taste, or appearance, while others used food tasters or testing methods to verify safety before consuming anything. The 7:00 a.m. service called Prime was followed by a chapter house meeting where nuns gathered to hear Bible readings or writings of saints. These gatherings provided opportunities for information sharing about potential threats, but also created risks because disagreements could escalate into violent confrontations, and the concentration of the entire community in one location made them vulnerable to coordinated attacks from external forces. Chapter house meetings were often the most politically charged times of the day, when community business was discussed and decisions were made that could affect everyone's survival. Nuns learned to navigate these sessions carefully, avoiding confrontations that could create lasting enemies while still advocating for their own interests and safety. The concentration of the entire community in one room during these meetings created security vulnerabilities that attackers could exploit. Some convents established lookouts during chapter meetings to watch for external threats, while others developed evacuation procedures that could be implemented quickly if danger emerged. During tiers at 9:00 a.m., nuns would begin their daily work assignments, which included farming, cooking, cleaning, and craft production that exposed them to numerous dangers throughout the day. These activities included workplace injuries that could be fatal without proper medical care, poisoning through contaminated food preparation, and attacks while working in isolated areas of the convent grounds where help might not arrive in time to prevent serious harm. The manual labor required in medieval convents was backbreaking and dangerous work that would challenge modern workers even with safety equipment and medical backup readily available. Nuns had to manage heavy agricultural tools that could cause serious injuries if mishandled, work with dangerous animals that could kick, bite, or trample unwary handlers, handle toxic materials used in various crafts and manufacturing processes, and perform construction and maintenance tasks that required climbing, lifting, and operating in hazardous conditions. Agricultural work was particularly dangerous because it required nuns to work in isolated fields where they were vulnerable to attack and couldn't call for help if emergencies arose. Some communities developed buddy systems where nuns worked in pairs, while others established regular check-in procedures to ensure that missing workers would be discovered quickly. Tools used in medieval agriculture were often improvised weapons that could be deadly in the wrong hands. Scythes, axes, hammers, and knives were essential for various tasks, but they also represented security risks if they fell into the hands of attackers or were used by community members during violent disputes. Food preparation was another high-risk activity that required constant attention to safety and security. Medieval kitchens were filled with open flames, boiling liquids, sharp knives, and other hazards that could cause serious injuries. Additionally, the food preparation process created opportunities for poisoning, whether accidental or intentional, that could affect large numbers of people simultaneously. The midday service of sex nun at 12:00 p.m. was followed by dinner eaten in complete silence while one nun read aloud from religious texts. This enforced silence created serious security challenges because nuns couldn't verbally warn each other of threats, requiring the development of elaborate visual communication systems that had to be learned and practiced until they became instinctive responses to various types of danger. These visual communication systems included hand signals, facial expressions, and body language that could convey warnings about external threats, internal conflicts, or medical emergencies without violating the rule of silence. The most sophisticated systems could communicate complex information about the type, location, and severity of threats, allowing communities to respond appropriately without creating panic or confusion. The reading during meals served multiple purposes beyond spiritual edification. It provided cover for the sounds of eating, which could mask the approach of attackers, but it also created a distraction that could prevent nuns from noticing threats until it was too late to respond effectively. Afternoon work periods after dinner were particularly dangerous because they often involved traveling to remote parts of the convent property for agricultural work or resource gathering that took individuals away from the relative safety of the main buildings. Smart nuns learned to work in pairs or groups and established check-in procedures to ensure no one went missing without immediate notice from other community members. These afternoon hours also brought increased risks from external threats, as this was when bandits and other criminals were most likely to scout potential targets and plan attacks for later execution. The combination of scattered workers and reduced vigilance after the midday meal created perfect opportunities for hostile forces to infiltrate convent grounds and gather intelligence for future attacks. Remote work areas required special security arrangements, including designated lookouts, emergency signals, and predetermined assembly points where workers could gather if threats emerged. Some convents established safe rooms in outlying buildings where workers could take shelter until help arrived or dangers passed. 4. The corruption network surviving church politics and predatory officials. The medieval church was supposed to protect nuns and provide them with spiritual guidance and material support, but it often became their greatest source of danger and systematic exploitation. Corrupt bishops, ambitious abbots, and politically motivated officials created a web of institutional threats that was nearly impossible to navigate safely, requiring nuns to develop sophisticated political intelligence that many learned through bitter and often traumatic experience that left lasting scars on individuals and communities. Church authorities held enormous power over every aspect of convent life, controlling funding decisions that could mean the difference between prosperity and starvation, appointing leadership positions that determined community direction and survival strategies, and conducting periodic inspections that could result in punishment, closure, or seizure of property. A nun who found herself on the wrong side of church politics faced professional destruction and personal danger that could include imprisonment, exile, or worse punishments that were rarely recorded in official documents but were well understood by religious communities. The power imbalance was so extreme that church officials could destroy entire convents on a whim, and the women who lived there had virtually no recourse through official channels. Appeals to higher authorities were often futile because corruption extended throughout the ecclesiastical hierarchy, and secular authorities were generally reluctant to interfere in church matters even when obvious abuses were occurring. Sexual predation by church officials was a widespread and systematic problem that created constant fear among religious women throughout the medieval period. Nuns were particularly vulnerable because they couldn't easily report abuse without risking the destruction of their entire community, and the power imbalance was so extreme that resistance often seemed futile and potentially suicidal for everyone involved. The corruption took many different forms, from direct sexual assault to psychological manipulation that could be just as devastating to victims and their communities. Some church officials would demand sexual favors in exchange for favorable treatment, protection from other threats, or simply not fabricating charges that could destroy individual nuns or entire communities through false accusations that were difficult to disprove. Others used their authority to create situations where sexual assault was virtually inevitable, then threatened their victims with punishment if they complained or sought help from outside sources. The isolation of convent communities made it easy for predatory officials to operate without oversight, and the religious authority they wielded made it difficult for victims to resist or seek justice. Bishops and their representatives often demanded bribes and kickbacks in exchange for favorable treatment or simply leaving communities alone to pursue their religious duties without interference. These corrupt officials would manufacture violations during inspections to justify seizing property or demanding payments, creating a protection racket that operated under the cover of religious authority and legal legitimacy. The corruption was so systematic that many convents were forced to maintain separate accounting systems, one for official inspections and another that tracked the real costs of survival, including the bribes and payments necessary to avoid punishment for imaginary violations that could be invented whenever officials needed additional revenue. Some communities spent more money on bribes and protection payments than they did on basic necessities like food, clothing, and maintenance of their buildings. This created additional survival challenges, as nuns had to choose between buying safety from corrupt officials and maintaining the resources necessary for basic survival. The inspection system, supposedly designed to maintain religious standards and ensure proper observance of monastic rules, became a tool of systematic oppression and exploitation that terrorized religious communities throughout the medieval period. Corrupt inspectors would arrive unannounced and spend days or weeks looking for any excuse to impose fines, demand corrections, or threaten closure, consuming valuable fruit supplies while conducting their investigations. These inspections often became fishing expeditions where officials would pressure nuns to provide information about their sisters, creating an atmosphere of suspicion and mistrust that could tear communities apart from within. The psychological pressure of these visits was immense, as entire communities lived in fear of saying or doing something that could be twisted into evidence of wrongdoing by officials who were motivated by greed rather than genuine concern for religious standards. Inspectors developed sophisticated techniques for manufacturing violations when none actually existed. They would examine every aspect of convent life looking for minor deviations from rules that could be blown out of proportion, question nuns individually to create contradictory statements, and interpret innocent actions as evidence of serious wrongdoing. Some officials would plant evidence of violations, bringing contraband items with them and discovering them during searches, or coaching witnesses to provide false testimony against community members who had refused to cooperate with corrupt schemes. The aftermath of negative inspection reports could be devastating for entire communities. Convents that received poor evaluations faced reduced funding, increased oversight, replacement of leadership, or complete closure depending on the severity of the alleged violations and the political motivations of the inspecting officials. 5. The economics of desperation, financial survival in a hostile world. Medieval convents operated on precarious economic foundations that made them vulnerable to exploitation, manipulation, and outright theft from multiple sources simultaneously. Understanding and managing these financial realities was crucial for both individual survival and community stability, requiring nuns to develop business skills that were rarely taught in religious education and had to be learned through experience that could be fatal if mistakes were made or opportunities were missed. Many convents struggled with basic subsistence issues that could mean the difference between life and death for entire communities during harsh economic periods. Unlike male monasteries, which often had more diverse income sources and better political connections to protect their interests, nunneries frequently faced chronic underfunding that left them vulnerable to economic pressure from hostile forces who knew they had limited options for resistance or retaliation. The systematic underfunding of women's religious communities was often deliberate, reflecting broader medieval attitudes about women's capabilities and worth. Church authorities would allocate resources preferentially to male institutions, leaving convents to survive on whatever remained after more favored communities had been supported. The dowry system created additional economic pressures and opportunities for exploitation that affected both individual nuns and entire communities in complex ways. Families who placed daughters in convents were expected to provide financial support in the form of cash payments, land grants, or valuable goods, but these payments were often irregular, insufficient, or withheld entirely when family fortunes changed or political relationships shifted. This created situations where nuns might find themselves abandoned by their families and left without the financial support that their communities had been counting on for basic operations. Some families would promise substantial support to gain admission for their daughters, then default on their obligations once the women had taken permanent vows and couldn't leave without facing serious legal and social consequences. The most manipulative families would use economic leverage to control their daughters' behavior even after they had entered religious life. They might threaten to withdraw support unless the nuns provided information about convent activities, influenced community decisions in favor of family interests, or provided other services that went beyond their religious duties. Agricultural management became a matter of survival rather than simply supporting religious life, as many convents depended entirely on farming for both food production and income generation that kept them operational during difficult periods. Nuns learned to manage complex crop rotations that maximized soil fertility, livestock breeding programs that produced the highest quality animals, and seasonal labor cycles that coordinated farming activities with religious obligations. Poor agricultural decisions could result in famine conditions that would kill substantial portions of the community, making farming knowledge as important as religious knowledge for long-term survival. The most successful agricultural nuns became experts in weather prediction techniques, soil management practices, pest control methods, and crop storage techniques that could keep their communities alive during difficult years when other food sources were unavailable. The farming work was physically demanding and dangerous, requiring nuns to operate heavy equipment, work with unpredictable animals, and perform strenuous labor in all weather conditions. Injuries were common and could be fatal without proper medical treatment, which was often unavailable in remote convent locations. Climate variations could destroy entire communities if agricultural planning was inadequate. Bad weather, crop diseases, or pest infestations could eliminate food supplies and income simultaneously, leaving convents without resources to purchase alternative supplies or survive until the next growing season. Trade relationships required careful cultivation and constant maintenance, as convents often sold handmade goods, religious artifacts, agricultural products, or specialized services to support themselves financially. Developing reliable trading partnerships was essential for economic survival, but also required business negotiation skills that many nuns had to learn through trial and error that could be expensive or dangerous if mistakes were made. The markets for convent products were often controlled by the same people who posed other threats to religious communities, creating complex relationships where economic partners might also be potential enemies depending on changing circumstances. Some traders would deliberately create dependency relationships, then exploit those connections to demand sexual favors, inside information, or other concessions that went far beyond normal business arrangements. Economic warfare was a real threat that could destroy communities without any physical violence, making it an attractive option for enemies who wanted to avoid the risks associated with direct military attacks. Hostile forces might attempt to bankrupt convents by disrupting trade relationships, spreading false rumors about product quality, stealing resources, or manipulating local markets to disadvantage religious competitors. Some attacks were more sophisticated, involving coordinated campaigns to destroy multiple income sources simultaneously. Enemies might bribe key customers to cancel orders, persuade suppliers to raise prices dramatically, and pressure transportation providers to refuse service, creating economic disasters that could be just as devastating as military raids but harder to defend against or recover from. Resource hiding became a sophisticated art form in successful convents, as communities learned to conceal wealth, valuable items, and essential supplies from potential raiders, corrupt officials, and internal thieves who might be community members. This required developing complex inventory management systems and secure storage methods that could survive both surprise inspections and violent attacks while remaining accessible to legitimate users. The most successful communities maintained multiple hidden caches of resources distributed throughout their property, ensuring that the loss of any single storage location wouldn't mean complete disaster for the entire community. These hiding systems had to be sophisticated enough to fool experienced inspectors and treasure hunters while remaining accessible to legitimate community members who might need emergency access during crisis situations. 6. The social minefield navigating deadly internal politics. Life within medieval convents was far from the harmonious sisterhood often depicted in popular imagination or religious propaganda. Internal politics could be as dangerous as external threats, requiring nuns to develop sophisticated social intelligence and political maneuvering skills just to survive daily interactions with their supposed sisters in faith. The closed nature of these communities created pressure cooker environments where small conflicts could escalate into life-threatening situations that destroyed individuals and entire communities. Hierarchical tensions created constant friction that could escalate into serious violence between community members. The social backgrounds of nuns varied enormously, from noble daughters seeking to maintain their elevated status to peasant women fleeing poverty or abuse. These class differences created deep resentments and competitive dynamics that sometimes turned deadly, as women from different backgrounds struggled to maintain their dignity and position within the artificial equality that religious life was supposed to provide. The most dangerous conflicts often arose when noble-born nuns expected difference from their social inferiors, while women from lower classes resented being forced to submit to aristocratic attitudes that contradicted their supposed spiritual equality. These tensions were exacerbated by the fact that wealthy families could purchase better treatment for their daughters through donations and special arrangements that created visible inequalities within supposedly egalitarian communities. Some communities developed informal caste systems that recreated secular social hierarchies within religious settings, despite official rules that prohibited such distinctions. Noble nuns might receive better food, more comfortable living quarters, or lighter work assignments, while the social inferiors were relegated to the most difficult and dangerous tasks. Leadership struggles were particularly dangerous during succession periods when abbesses died or were removed from office by external authorities. The process of selecting new leadership could tear communities apart as different factions emerged, each supporting different candidates based on family connections, personal loyalties, ideological differences, or promises of favorable treatment under the new administration. Being on the losing side of these succession battles could result in exile, punishment, assignment to dangerous duties, or worse consequences that were rarely documented in official records but were well understood by community members. Some nuns would sabotage rivals' chances through character assassination, manufactured evidence of wrongdoing, or violence that was designed to appear accidental. The most sophisticated political operators learned to play multiple sides simultaneously, appearing to support different candidates while positioning themselves to benefit regardless of the outcome. This required exceptional diplomatic skills and careful management of information to avoid being exposed as duplicitous by any of the competing factions. Clique formation was both inevitable and extremely hazardous in closed community environments where women were forced to live together for decades without the possibility of escape. Groups of nuns would band together based on social background, regional origin, personal friendships, shared interests, or mutual protection needs. These cliques could provide essential protection and support during dangerous periods, but also made individuals targets if their group fell from favor or lost power struggles with rival factions. The most successful cliques maintained flexibility in their membership and alliances, understanding that permanent loyalty could become a liability if circumstances changed. They developed systems for sharing information, resources, and protection while maintaining plausible deniability if their activities were discovered by hostile authorities or rival groups. Some cliques became so powerful that they effectively controlled entire communities, making decisions collectively and enforcing their will through various forms of pressure that ranged from social ostracism to physical violence. These informal power structures often operated parallel to official leadership hierarchies and sometimes superseded them entirely. Resource competition intensified during difficult economic periods when access to better food, warmer clothing, more comfortable living quarters, or preferred work assignments became sources of serious conflict between community members. Nuns learned to navigate these competitions carefully to avoid making enemies who might seek revenge through violence, sabotage, or political maneuvering that could destroy their positions within the community. The competition was particularly intense for positions that provided access to external contacts, financial resources, or information that could be used for personal advantage. Roles like treasurer, gatekeeper, or liaison with external authorities offered opportunities for corruption and personal enrichment that made them highly desirable and fiercely contested. Some nuns would form temporary alliances to eliminate rivals for desirable positions, then turn on their former allies once the immediate competition was resolved. This created an atmosphere of constant suspicion and mistrust where genuine friendship became almost impossible to maintain safely. Scandal management required collective action and careful coordination to protect communities from external punishment when individual members violated rules or brought disgrace to the institution. When individual nuns violated rules, brought disgrace to the community, or committed serious crimes, the entire convent faced potential dissolution or severe penalties from church authorities who held communities collectively responsible for individual misconduct. Successful communities develop systems for handling these situations discreetly while protecting innocent members from collective punishment. This might involve covering up evidence of wrongdoing, providing false testimony to investigators, or eliminating problematic individuals through methods that appear natural or accidental. The most sophisticated cover-up operations involve multiple community members working in coordination to create false narratives, destroy evidence, and intimidate potential witnesses. These activities required careful planning and absolute loyalty from participants who understood that exposure would mean destruction for everyone involved. Information control was crucial for survival in environments where rumors and gossip could destroy reputations and lives within days or hours. Smart nuns learned to manage information flow carefully, controlling what reached church authorities, secular officials, or outside observers while maintaining internal communication networks that kept community members informed about developing threats and opportunities. The most successful information managers maintained relationships with multiple sources both inside and outside their communities, allowing them to verify stories, identify false information, and control narratives that could affect their survival. They understood that information was often more valuable than money or physical resources in determining who survived and who became casualties. Alliance building required constant attention and diplomatic skills that would challenge modern politicians working in democratic systems. Successful nuns cultivated relationships with multiple groups within their communities, ensuring they had support regardless of changing circumstances and leadership transitions. This required exceptional emotional intelligence, strategic thinking, and the ability to maintain multiple friendships simultaneously without creating conflicts of loyalty. The most sophisticated alliance builders understood that relationships had to be maintained over decades through consistent small favors, emotional support, and strategic assistance during crises. They developed reputations as reliable allies who could be trusted with secrets and counted on for support during dangerous periods. 7. The health crisis, medical survival, and plague and pestilence. Medieval convents faced constant health crises that threatened both individual survival and community stability in ways that modern people can barely comprehend. Without access to modern medicine, antiseptic procedures, or understanding of disease transmission, nuns had to develop sophisticated strategies for maintaining health and treating illness using only medieval knowledge and extremely limited resources that were often insufficient for basic survival needs. Disease outbreaks could devastate entire communities within days or weeks, transforming thriving religious centers into charnel houses where the living struggled to dispose of the dead. The close quarters and shared facilities of convent life made infectious diseases particularly dangerous, as illnesses could spread rapidly through dormitories, dining halls, work areas, and chapel spaces where community members gathered for religious services. Understanding basic quarantine procedures and early symptom recognition became matters of life and death that separated surviving communities from those that were completely destroyed by disease. The most successful convents developed protocols for isolating sick members, restricting movement between different areas of the complex, and maintaining essential functions even when large portions of the community were incapacitated by illness. The Black Death and other plague outbreaks specifically targeted religious communities because of their density and interconnectedness with broader transportation and trade networks. When plague struck a convent, mortality rates often exceeded 80%, leaving small numbers of survivors to deal with massive numbers of corpses, collapsed community structures, and complete economic devastation that made recovery almost impossible. Some communities disappeared entirely during plague outbreaks, with no survivors remaining to maintain the buildings, preserve records, or continue religious observances. The abandoned convents would slowly decay over decades, becoming ruins that served as monuments to the communities that had once thrived within their walls. Malnutrition was a constant threat that weakened immune systems and made nuns vulnerable to diseases that might not affect well-fed populations. The combination of religious fasting requirements, limited financial resources, and periodic food shortages meant that many nuns suffered from chronic malnutrition that had serious long-term health consequences, including increased susceptibility to infection, slow healing of injuries, and premature death from conditions that should have been survivable. The religious emphasis on fasting and self-denial created additional health risks that community leaders had to balance against spiritual obligations. Some convents developed flexible fasting rules that could be modified during health emergencies, while others maintained strict observance even when members were dying from starvation-related illnesses. Herbal medicine became an essential survival skill that separated successful communities from those that perished during health crises. Many nuns became expert healers who developed extensive knowledge of medicinal plants, preparation techniques, and treatment procedures that could save lives within the community, and also provided valuable services that could be traded for resources with external communities. The development of herbal expertise required years of study and practical experience that built upon knowledge passed down through generations of religious women. The most successful medical nuns maintained detailed records of their treatments, outcomes, and plant preparations that became valuable resources for future generations and could be copied and shared with other communities. Some convents became regional centers of medical knowledge where sick people from surrounding areas would come seeking treatment from nuns who had developed reputations as skilled healers. This provided additional income and political connections, but also exposed communities to diseases carried by outside patients and created security risks when large numbers of desperate people gathered around convent walls. Mental health challenges were largely unrecognized but extremely dangerous in medieval contexts where psychological problems were often attributed to demonic possession or moral failing. The stress of convent life, combined with social isolation, constant threats, and rigorous religious demands, led to psychological problems that could result in violence, self-harm, or complete mental breakdown that threatened entire communities. Some nuns developed what modern psychiatrists would recognize as severe anxiety disorders, depression, or post-traumatic stress symptoms that manifested in various ways, including insomnia, aggressive behavior, paranoid delusions, or catatonic withdrawal. These conditions were poorly understood and often treated with methods that made them worse, including exorcism, physical restraint, or complete social isolation. The most enlightened communities developed informal counseling systems where experienced nuns provided emotional support and practical guidance to members who were struggling with psychological difficulties. These support networks could prevent minor problems from escalating into major crises that might require external intervention or result in violence. Childbirth remained a significant danger even in convents despite vows of chastity that were supposed to eliminate this risk. Pregnancy occurred more often than church authorities wanted to admit, whether through consensual relationships, sexual assault, or pre-convent experiences that had not been fully disclosed during the admission process. Nuns had to develop discreet methods for handling these situations without destroying their entire communities through scandal that would bring severe punishment from ecclesiastical authorities. Some communities maintained secret medical expertise for handling difficult births, while others developed relationships with external midwives who could be trusted to provide assistance without reporting the situations to hostile authorities. The most sophisticated communities developed protocols for protecting mothers and children while maintaining plausible deniability about the circumstances of births. This might involve temporary relocations, false documentation, or arrangements with external families who would adopt children born within convent walls. Workplace injuries were common and potentially fatal without proper medical treatment in environments where all work was manual and dangerous. The manual labor required in medieval convents, from heavy agricultural work to construction projects, created constant risks of serious injury, including broken bones, deep cuts, burns, and crushing injuries that could be fatal without immediate and effective treatment. Medieval medical knowledge was insufficient for treating many types of trauma that are easily handled by modern emergency medicine. Nuns learned basic first aid techniques, but serious injuries often resulted in permanent disability or death that reduced community capabilities and created additional burdens for remaining members. The most successful communities developed safety protocols that reduced the frequency and severity of workplace injuries through better training, safer working procedures, and protective equipment that was available within medieval technological limitations. They also maintained relationships with external medical practitioners who could provide emergency treatment for injuries that exceeded their internal capabilities. Dental problems and vision issues could be debilitating in environments where all work required physical capability and there was no accommodation for disabilities. Medieval dental care was primitive and often dangerous, with extractions being the primary treatment for most problems. Vision problems were even more difficult to address, as corrective lenses were not available and many tasks required clear sight. Nuns with serious dental or vision problems often became burdens on their communities rather than contributing members, creating social tensions and resource allocation problems that could affect their survival prospects. Some communities developed alternative roles for disabled members that allowed them to contribute according to their capabilities, while others viewed disability as divine punishment that should be endured without complaint. 8. The intelligence network information as survival tool. Medieval convents that survived and thrived developed sophisticated intelligence networks that rivaled anything created by secular governments or military organizations. Information about external threats, internal conflicts, political changes, and resource opportunities was often more valuable than gold or weapons in determining which communities survived dangerous periods and which became casualties of ignorance and poor preparation. The most successful intelligence operations combined internal information gathering with external reconnaissance that provided early warning about developing threats and emerging opportunities. Nuns learned to position themselves in locations where they could overhear important conversations, observe suspicious activities, and gather information about the intentions and capabilities of potential enemies or allies. Internal intelligence focused on understanding the motivations, laws, and plans of community members who might pose threats through violence, sabotage, or collaboration with hostile external forces. This required developing psychological profiles of community members, monitoring their relationships and activities, and identifying early warning signs of dangerous behavior before it could escalate into serious threats. The most sophisticated internal intelligence operators maintained detailed mental records of every community member's background, relationships, psychological state, and potential motivations for betrayal or violence. They understood that survival often depended on predicting which individuals might become dangerous under specific circumstances and preparing countermeasures accordingly. External intelligence gathering required building relationships with travelers, merchants, local officials, and members of other religious communities who could provide information about political developments, military movements, and social changes that might affect convent security. Some nuns became expert interrogators who could extract valuable information from casual conversations without revealing their intelligence interests. The most valuable external intelligence concerned military threats, political changes, and economic developments that could affect community safety and survival prospects. Advance warning about approaching armies, changes in local leadership, or economic disruptions could provide crucial time for defensive preparations or strategic retreats that could save entire communities. Communication networks allowed successful convents to share intelligence with allied communities and coordinate responses to common threats. These networks require careful security measures to prevent infiltration by hostile forces who might use the communication channels to spread false information or gather intelligence about defensive preparations. Some communication networks became so sophisticated that they could rapidly transmit information across hundreds of miles through chains of trusted intermediaries who understood the importance of speed and accuracy in intelligence transmission. These networks often operated more efficiently than official government communication systems and could provide information that was unavailable through official channels. Counterintelligence operations protected communities from hostile intelligence gathering while maintaining the security of their own information networks. This required identifying enemy agents, feeding false information to hostile sources, and protecting the identities of friendly intelligence assets who provided valuable information about enemy activities and intentions. The most sophisticated counterintelligence operations involved elaborate deception schemes that convinced enemies to make strategic errors based on false information about community capabilities, resources, or defensive preparations. These operations required careful planning and coordination to maintain credibility while achieving strategic objectives. Information verification became crucial for distinguishing between accurate intelligence and false information that might be deliberately planted by enemies to create confusion or panic. Successful intelligence operators developed methods for confirming important information through multiple independent sources and understanding the motivations of information providers who might have reasons to lie or exaggerate. The most reliable information came from sources who had consistent records of accuracy and who had personal motivations for providing truthful intelligence. Understanding these motivations was crucial for assessing the reliability of information and determining how much trust to place in particular sources during crisis situations. 9. The economic warfare, financial combat, and resource control. Medieval convents engaged in sophisticated forms of economic warfare that could be more devastating than military attacks and harder to defend against or recover from. Understanding these financial combat techniques was essential for community survival, as enemies who couldn't defeat convents through direct violence often attempted to destroy them through economic manipulation, resource disruption, and systematic financial warfare. Market manipulation was one of the most effective forms of economic warfare that hostile forces could use against religious communities. Enemies might coordinate to boycott convent products, spread false rumors about quality or religious orthodoxy, or manipulate prices to make it impossible for communities to earn sufficient income from their traditional economic activities. Some market manipulation campaigns involve bribing key customers to cancel orders, persuading suppliers to refuse service or dramatically increase prices, and pressuring transportation providers to boycott religious communities. These coordinated attacks could create economic disasters that were just as devastating as military raids but left no obvious evidence of hostile action. The most sophisticated economic attacks involved creating artificial competition that undercut convent prices while maintaining unsustainable business models designed to drive religious communities out of specific markets. Once the convents were eliminated as competitors, the artificial competition would disappear and normal market conditions would be restored, but the religious communities would have lost their economic foundations permanently. Resource disruption targeted the supply chains that communities depended on for basic survival needs, including food, fuel, construction materials, and manufactured goods that couldn't be produced internally. Enemies might bribe suppliers to refuse service, sabotage transportation systems, or create artificial shortages that forced convents to pay inflated prices for essential resources. The most vulnerable communities were those that depended on single sources for critical resources or that couldn't store sufficient supplies to survive temporary disruptions. Successful communities developed diversified supply chains with multiple backup sources and maintained emergency stockpiles that could sustain them during extended periods of economic warfare. Some resource disruption campaigns targeted specific seasonal needs like fuel for winter heating or seed for spring planting, timing the attacks to create maximum hardship when alternative sources were unavailable or prohibitively expensive. These precisely timed attacks could destroy communities even if they had substantial resources available during other seasons. Financial manipulation involved sophisticated schemes designed to trap convents in unsustainable debt arrangements or fraudulent business relationships that would gradually transfer their wealth to hostile parties. Some schemes involved loans with hidden terms, business partnerships with deceptive profit-sharing arrangements, or investment opportunities that were designed to fail after initial profits convinced communities to risk substantial resources. The most dangerous financial manipulation involved creating dependency relationships where convents became reliant on economic arrangements that could be withdrawn suddenly to create instant financial crises. Some enemies would provide essential services at below market rates to create dependency, then suddenly demand full payment or threaten to withdraw services entirely unless unreasonable terms were accepted. Currency manipulation could devastate communities that held their wealth in specific forms of money or precious metals that could be devalued through political action or market manipulation. Some enemies had sufficient political influence to change currency exchange rates, declare specific types of money invalid, or create artificial shortages of precious metals that communities needed for their financial operations. The most sophisticated currency manipulation involved creating artificial inflation or deflation in specific regions to advantage some economic actors while disadvantaging others. Communities that understood these techniques could sometimes profit from currency manipulation, while those that were unaware of the schemes often lost substantial wealth without understanding why their financial situations had deteriorated. Property seizure was often the ultimate goal of economic warfare campaigns that were designed to force communities into situations where they couldn't meet their financial obligations and would lose their land, buildings, and other assets to creditors or legal authorities. Some schemes involved decades of careful financial manipulation designed to gradually weaken communities until they became vulnerable to final seizure attempts. The most effective property seizure schemes involved creating legal pretexts for confiscation through manufactured violations of complex financial regulations or contractual obligations that communities couldn't possibly fulfill completely. These legal seizures had the appearance of legitimate government action, but were actually the culmination of long-term economic warfare campaigns. 10. The survival mastery advanced techniques for ultimate security. The most extraordinary medieval nuns eventually developed comprehensive survival systems that integrated all the various techniques we've discussed into seamless approaches that could handle multiple simultaneous threats while maintaining the appearance of normal religious life. These ultimate masters combined military strategy, political intelligence, economic planning, medical knowledge, and psychological warfare into comprehensive systems that could protect entire communities under virtually any circumstances that might develop. These ultimate survival systems required years of development and careful refinement based on practical experience with real threats and crises. The most successful communities learned from their mistakes and continuously improved their defensive capabilities while maintaining the religious observances and community structures that define their identity as religious institutions. Comprehensive threat assessment became the foundation for all other survival activities, requiring communities to understand all the various types of dangers they might face and the relationships between different threat categories. This required maintaining detailed intelligence about external military threats, internal political dynamics, economic vulnerabilities, health risks, and any other factors that might affect community survival. The most sophisticated threat assessment systems included regular reviews of changing circumstances, updated intelligence about developing dangers, and contingency planning for various crisis scenarios that might require different response strategies. These assessments had to be conducted discreetly to avoid revealing defensive capabilities or concerns to potential enemies who might use the information to plan more effective attacks. Integrated defense systems combined multiple survival techniques into coordinated approaches that could address complex threats requiring responses from several different areas of expertise simultaneously. A single crisis might involve external military threats, internal political conflicts, economic disruption, and health emergencies that all had to be handled simultaneously by community members with different areas of expertise. The most effective integrated defense systems included clear command structures for crisis situations, predetermined roles for community members during emergencies, and communication systems that could coordinate responses even when normal leadership structures were disrupted by casualties or other crisis-related problems. Adaptive strategy development allowed the most successful communities to modify their survival approaches based on changing circumstances, new threats, and lessons learned from previous crises. This required maintaining flexibility in planning while ensuring that essential defensive capabilities were always available regardless of how external circumstances might change. The most adaptive communities developed multiple contingency plans for various crisis scenarios and regularly updated their strategies based on new intelligence, changing resources, and evolving threat patterns. They understood that survival strategies that worked in one situation might be completely inappropriate for different types of crises. Resource optimization ensured that communities could maintain maximum defensive capability despite limited resources that had to be allocated carefully between immediate survival needs and long-term security investments. This required understanding the relative importance of different types of resources and making strategic decisions about how to allocate limited supplies for maximum survival advantage. The most successful resource optimization strategies included developing multiple uses for single resources, maintaining supplies that could serve various purposes during different types of crises, and building relationships with external sources that could provide additional resources during emergencies when internal supplies were insufficient. Legacy planning ensured that survival knowledge and techniques would be preserved and transmitted to future generations even if current community members were eliminated by various threats. This required developing training systems, documentation methods, and succession planning that could maintain community defensive capabilities even after significant casualties or leadership changes. The most effective legacy planning included detailed written records of survival techniques, formal training programs for new community members, and relationships with external allies who could provide assistance in rebuilding communities that had been severely damaged by various types of attacks or crises. These ultimate survival masters understood that their techniques needed to remain secret to be effective, as enemies who understood their methods could develop countermeasures that would neutralize their defensive advantages. They learned to disguise their security activities as normal religious practices and to maintain the appearance of vulnerable, defenseless communities while actually operating sophisticated defensive systems that could handle virtually any threat that might emerge. The most successful communities became so skilled at disguising their capabilities that even their enemies underestimated their defensive preparations, leading to failed attacks that actually strengthened the community's positions and reputations. This reputation for being divinely protected or exceptionally fortunate often provided additional security by discouraging potential attackers who believed the communities possessed supernatural protection or were too dangerous to attack successfully. 16. The real horror stories documented cases of convent violence and survival. The sanitized version of medieval convent life that most people imagine bears no resemblance to the brutal realities documented in church records, legal proceedings, and survivor accounts that have managed to survive centuries of censorship and cover-ups. These real incidents revealed the shocking truth about what actually happened behind convent walls when survival instincts clashed with religious ideals, creating situations that would horrify modern readers but were considered routine challenges in medieval religious life. The case of the nun of Warden, documented around 1160 by Saint Edward of Revolx, demonstrates how quickly convent life could turn deadly when survival strategies failed. This young woman, brought to Warden Priory in Yorkshire as a child, had never wanted religious life but found herself trapped by circumstances beyond her control. When she secretly began meeting with a lay brother from the men's section of the double monastery, she was using one of the most common survival strategies, building alliances with potential protectors who might help her escape her circumstances. The secret meetings continued for months using an elaborate system of stone-throwing signals that allowed the lovers to communicate across the strict gender barriers that supposedly separated the monastery section. This demonstrates the sophisticated communication networks that developed in religious communities, though in this case the system eventually failed when other nuns became suspicious of the repeated noise and began investigating. When the affair was discovered, the community's response reveals the deadly internal politics that could destroy individual nuns who made strategic miscalculations. The other nuns didn't simply report the violation to authorities, they seized and brutally beat the young woman in what can only be described as a gang assault motivated by religious zealotry mixed with personal jealousies and resentments that had been building within the closed community. The beating was so severe that senior sisters had to intervene to prevent the other nuns from burning, flaying, and branding their victim punishments that would have been fatal or permanently disfiguring. Even after the intervention, the woman was chained with leg fetters and imprisoned in solitary confinement on bread and water, a punishment regime that could easily result in death from malnutrition or disease. But the story gets worse. When the male culprit was tracked down by brothers from the monastery, the nuns' response demonstrated the kind of organized violence that survival in medieval convents sometimes required. In a scene that reads like something from a horror novel, the nuns forced the pregnant woman to castrate her lover with a knife while they held him down. Then one of the senior sisters forced the severed genitalia into the woman's mouth. This level of organized brutality reveals the psychological dynamics that could develop in closed religious communities where normal social controls had broken down. The nuns weren't just punishing rule violations, they were engaging in ritualized violence that served multiple psychological and social functions within the community power structures. The Littlemore Priory scandals of 1517–1518 provide another documented example of how survival strategies could backfire catastrophically when communities descended into violence and chaos. Catherine Wells, the prioress, represents a classic example of a leader who used brutal control methods to maintain power while simultaneously engaging in the same rule violation she was supposedly preventing in others. Wells had a child by the priory's chaplain and pawned the priory's religious treasures to pay for the child's upbringing, demonstrating how survival pressures could force even religious leaders into criminal activities. She maintained strict and often violent discipline over other nuns, regularly placing them in stocks for extended periods and physically assaulting them when they challenged her authority. The escape incident at Littlemore reveals how desperate some nuns became when survival within the community became impossible. When Prioress Wells placed Elizabeth Winter in the parlor stocks as punishment, 3 other nuns broke down the door to rescue her, destroyed the stocks by burning them, and then barricaded themselves against the prioress's retaliation. When this defensive position became untenable, all 4 women broke through a window and escaped into nearby villages where they hid for weeks. This escape demonstrates several sophisticated survival techniques that nuns developed when internal politics became deadly. The coordinated rescue operation required advanced planning and mutual trust between the participants. The destruction of the stocks was both practical, eliminating the punishment tool, and symbolic, rejecting the prioress's authority. The successful escape and extended hiding period required external allies and resources that the nuns had prepared in advance. The case of Sister Agnes and her wounded knight, documented in Bishop's records, shows how even successful survival strategies could eventually fail when they attracted too much attention. Agnes had developed a sophisticated cover story for her affair, claiming she was providing medical care to a wounded warrior as part of her Christian duty to heal the sick and injured. This religious justification for breaking celibacy vows was actually quite clever, as it reframed rule violation as religious virtue. The affair continued for 12 months, with the knight living secretly within the convent, sometimes wearing borrowed monk's robes and helping with garden work to maintain his disguise. This level of operational security required extensive planning, community complicity, and sophisticated risk management that kept the relationship hidden from authorities for an extended period. However, the operation eventually failed when a novice reported strange clanking noises from Agnes's cell, leading to the discovery of the knight hiding behind a tapestry, eating preserved figs, and humming hymns to pass the time. The casual nature of his hiding suggests that he had become overconfident after months of successful deception, a common failure mode in long-term survival operations. When confronted, Agnes doubled down on her religious justification, stating that she was caring for the wounded and that compassion was a holy virtue. She even wrote letters protesting the church's hypocrisy after being punished, quoting scripture and medical texts in her defense. One particularly memorable line from her defense was, "Had I let him die, I'd be a sinner still," demonstrating sophisticated theological argumentation that challenged her accuser's moral authority. The case of Sister Beatrix from the Low Countries represents a different survival strategy that used mystical religious experiences to gain protection and status within dangerous convent environments. Beatrix claimed that Christ came to her nightly, not metaphorically but physically, and wrote detailed descriptions of divine embraces and spiritual union that provided her with special religious authority. This strategy was particularly dangerous because it required walking a fine line between acceptable mystical experience and heretical claims that could result in execution. Beatrix's writings described her experiences in terms that could be interpreted as either profound spiritual encounters or sexual fantasies, depending on the reader's perspective and political motivations. The ambiguous nature of mystical experiences provided some protection because church authorities were reluctant to condemn what might be genuine divine revelation, but it also created vulnerabilities because rivals could use the same descriptions as evidence of mental illness, demonic possession, or sexual impropriety. The story of Clara in Bologna represents perhaps the most extreme survival strategy documented in medieval records. When her convent faced complete economic collapse, Clara transformed the religious community into what church records carefully describe as a hospitality business, but what was clearly a sophisticated brothel operation that outperformed most legitimate monasteries in terms of financial success. Clara's operation was so successful that it attracted customers from across the region and generated substantial profits that kept her community fed, housed, and protected when legitimate religious funding had completely disappeared. The operation was sophisticated enough to maintain the external appearance of a functioning convent while providing services that generated sufficient income to support the entire community. When church authorities finally discovered the true nature of Clara's hospitality business, their response reveals how threatening successful female entrepreneurship was to established religious hierarchies. Clara was excommunicated twice just to be sure, demonstrating the level of panico success had created among male church officials who couldn't understand how a woman had built a more successful operation in their own institutions. 17. The Intelligence Wars. Information as life and death. Medieval convents developed intelligence networks that rivaled anything created by medieval governments or military organizations, understanding that information could mean the difference between survival and destruction for entire communities. These intelligence operations were sophisticated enough to gather information from across Europe, analyze complex political situations, and coordinate responses that could protect religious communities from threats that might emerge hundreds of miles away. The most successful convent intelligence operations combined multiple information gathering techniques into comprehensive systems that could provide early warning about military threats, political changes, economic disruptions, and social developments that might affect community safety. These systems required substantial resources, careful security measures, and sophisticated analysis capabilities that went far beyond what most people would associate with religious life. The case of the Benedictine nuns at Shaftesbury Abbey demonstrates how intelligence operations could provide crucial protection during periods of political instability. During the civil war between Stephen and Matilda in the 12th century, the nuns maintained active intelligence networks that provided advance warning of military movements, allowing them to hide their treasures, evacuate when necessary, and negotiate with whichever side seemed likely to win local conflicts. Their intelligence system included agents in multiple royal courts, relationships with traveling merchants who could carry information quickly across long distances, and coordination with other religious houses that could provide mutual warnings about developing threats. This network was so effective that Shaftesbury Abbey survived the Civil War period with minimal losses, while many other religious houses were completely destroyed. The intelligence gathering techniques used by medieval nuns included sophisticated methods for extracting information from casual conversations, observing behavioral patterns that might indicate hidden motivations, and interpreting political developments that could affect their community's future security. Some nuns became expert interrogators who could learn more from a single conversation with a traveling merchant than official diplomatic agents could discover through formal negotiations. Sister Margaret of Stratford developed such sophisticated intelligence analysis capabilities that she became an unofficial advisor to multiple political leaders who valued her ability to predict political developments and understand complex international relationships. Her analysis of the political situation during the Barons' War allowed several religious communities to position themselves advantageously before the conflict erupted into open warfare. Margaret's intelligence work required understanding the personal motivations of individual political leaders, the economic factors driving political conflicts, and the military capabilities of different factions that might affect the outcome of political struggles. Her analysis had to be accurate enough to base life and death decisions on, as communities that chose the wrong side in political conflicts often faced complete destruction. Counterintelligence operations became crucial for protecting communities from hostile intelligence gathering while maintaining the security of their own information networks. Some convents developed elaborate deception schemes that convinced enemies to make strategic errors based on false information about community resources, defensive capabilities, or political alignments. The nuns at Wherwell Abbey developed such sophisticated counterintelligence capabilities that they successfully convinced hostile forces that their community was much poorer and more vulnerable than it actually was, leading attackers to bypass them in favor of what appeared to be more profitable targets. This deception required carefully controlling what information reached potential enemies while maintaining networks that could provide accurate intelligence about threats. Information verification became a crucial skill for distinguishing between accurate intelligence and false information that might be deliberately planted by enemies to create confusion or panic. The most successful intelligence operators develop methods for confirming important information through multiple independent sources and understanding the motivations of information providers who might have reasons to lie or exaggerate. The verification process required understanding how information traveled through medieval communication networks, identifying the points where false information might be introduced, and developing relationships with sources who had proven track records of accuracy and reliability. This verification work was often more important than the initial information gathering because acting on false intelligence could be more dangerous than having no information at all. Communication security required developing methods for transmitting sensitive information without it being intercepted and understood by hostile forces. Some convents developed elaborate coding systems that allowed important messages to be disguised as routine religious correspondence or commercial transactions that wouldn't attract attention from potential interceptors. The coding systems had to be sophisticated enough to convey complex information while remaining simple enough that they could be used quickly during crisis situations when speed might be more important than perfect security. The most successful systems included backup methods for emergency communications when primary systems might be compromised or unavailable. 18. The economic warfare masters financial combat as survival tool. Medieval convents engaged in sophisticated forms of economic warfare that could destroy enemies without resorting to physical violence, understanding that financial attacks could be more devastating than military raids and much harder to defend against or recover from. The most successful economic warriors developed techniques that could systematically destroy hostile individuals or organizations while building their own communities' wealth and security. The economic warfare techniques developed by medieval nuns included market manipulation, resource control, financial fraud, property acquisition, and systematic economic sabotage that could eliminate competitors or enemies over extended periods. These techniques required sophisticated understanding of medieval economic systems, legal frameworks, and political relationships that affected how business was conducted across different regions. The Benedictine nuns at Amesbury Abbey developed such sophisticated economic warfare capabilities that they effectively controlled the world trade across large portions of southern England, using their position to eliminate competitors and build a monopoly that generated enormous wealth for their community. Their techniques included coordinating with other religious houses to fix prices, bribing officials to change regulations that favored their operations, and systematically sabotaging competitors' operations through various forms of economic attack. Their price-fixing operations require coordination with multiple other religious houses across different regions, careful timing to maximize impact on competitors, and sophisticated understanding of seasonal market patterns that affected when price manipulation would be most effective. The conspiracy was so successful that it took secular authorities years to understand why wool prices were behaving unpredictably and even longer to identify the religious houses responsible for the manipulation. The nuns also developed techniques for destroying competitors through systematic financial attacks that could force other wool producers out of business without any obvious signs of hostile action. They would coordinate to boycott certain suppliers, spread false information about product quality, manipulate transportation systems to favor their own operations, and used their political connections to change regulations in ways that disadvantaged competitors. Property acquisition warfare allowed some convents to systematically acquire land and resources from individuals or organizations that posed threats to their community's security or economic interests. These acquisition campaigns often took years or decades to complete but could result in the complete elimination of hostile neighbors or competitors while substantially expanding community resources and capabilities. The techniques used in property acquisition warfare included strategic lending operations that created unsustainable debt burdens, legal challenges based on complex property laws that most people didn't understand, political manipulation that changed local regulations to favor religious communities, and systematic economic pressure that forced property owners to sell at disadvantageous terms. Sister Joan of Barking developed such sophisticated property acquisition techniques that she managed to acquire most of the land surrounding her abbey over a period of 30 years, eliminating several hostile noble families who had previously threatened her community while building a substantial buffer zone that provided both economic resources and military security. Jones' acquisition campaign required understanding complex inheritance laws that governed how property could be transferred, identifying legal vulnerabilities that could be exploited through court challenges, building relationships with judges and legal officials who could influence case outcomes, and coordinating with other religious houses that could provide financial backing for expensive legal operations. Where source control warfare allowed convents to gain control over essential resources that their enemies needed for survival, then use that control to eliminate threats or extract concessions that advance community interests. These operations required understanding supply chains, transportation networks, and market relationships that affected how essential resources reached different communities. The Cistercian nuns at Miami gained control over most of the salt production in their region, then used their monopoly to eliminate several hostile nobles who had previously threatened the community. By controlling salt prices and availability, they could create economic crises for their enemies while generating substantial profits that funded community expansion and defensive improvements. The salt monopoly required coordinating with multiple salt producers across different locations, controlling transportation routes that carried salt to various markets, and maintaining political relationships that prevented secular authorities from breaking up their monopoly through legal or military action. The operation was so successful that it continued for over a century before being disrupted by broader political changes. Financial fraud operations allowed some convents to systematically steal resources from enemies or competitors through sophisticated schemes that were difficult to detect or prosecute under medieval legal systems. These operations required understanding banking practices, legal procedures, and political relationships that affected how financial crimes were investigated and punished. The fraud techniques included creating false documentation that supported fraudulent property claims, manipulating accounting systems to hide theft or embezzlement, coordinating with corrupt officials who could influence legal proceedings, and developing complex schemes that distributed liability among multiple participants to avoid individual prosecution. Sister Alice of Godstow developed such sophisticated financial fraud capabilities that she managed to steal substantial resources from several hostile noble families over a period of 20 years without being detected or prosecuted. Her techniques included creating false inheritance documents that supported fraudulent property claims, manipulating local court records to support her schemes, and coordinating with corrupt officials who helped cover up her activities. Alice's fraud operations required maintaining relationships with corrupt scribes who could create convincing false documents, understanding legal procedures well enough to exploit vulnerabilities in the court system, and building networks of accomplices who could provide alibis and false testimony when investigations occurred. 19. The medical warfare, healing and harming strategic tools. Medieval nuns developed sophisticated medical knowledge that could be used both to heal allies and harm enemies. Understanding that control over life and death through medical techniques provided enormous power that could be used strategically to advance community interests and eliminate threats. The most skilled medical practitioners could save lives when it served their purposes or end them when elimination of enemies was necessary for community survival. The medical techniques available to medieval nuns included herbal preparations that could heal or poison depending on dosage and application, surgical procedures that could save lives or create fatal complications depending on how they were performed, and diagnostic skills that could identify weaknesses in the enemies that could be exploited for strategic advantage. Sister Catherine of Winchester became legendary for her ability to cure diseases that other medical practitioners considered hopeless, but she was also rumored to have eliminated several enemies through medical treatments that appeared helpful but actually caused fatal complications that were difficult to detect or prove. Her medical knowledge was so sophisticated that she could predict exactly how long it would take for certain treatments to cause death and could time her interventions to coincide with political or military objectives that require the elimination of specific individuals. Catherine's techniques included herbal preparations that appeared to be standard medical treatments but contained additional ingredients that would cause delayed fatal reactions, surgical procedures that introduced infections or complications that would appear to be natural medical failures, and diagnostic consultations that provided her with information about enemies' health vulnerabilities that could be exploited later through various means. Her reputation as a healer provided perfect cover for access to potential victims who trusted her medical expertise and didn't suspect that treatments might be designed to harm rather than help. The medical context also provided explanations for deaths that occurred under her care, as medieval medicine had such high failure rates that additional deaths didn't attract suspicion from authorities who expected medical treatments to fail frequently. Poison expertise became a crucial survival skill for nuns who needed to eliminate threats without resorting to obvious violence that might trigger retaliation from authorities or enemies' allies. The most skilled poison practitioners could eliminate targets through substances that mimic natural diseases, created accidents that appeared unintentional, or caused gradual deterioration that looked like normal aging or chronic illness. The poison techniques required sophisticated understanding of human anatomy, knowledge of how different substances affected bodily functions, and ability to predict timing and symptoms that would result from various toxic preparations. The most effective poisons were those that couldn't be detected through available medieval testing methods and that produced symptoms consistent with common natural diseases. Sister Margaret of Romsey developed such sophisticated poison expertise that she could eliminate enemies through substances that were virtually undetectable and that produced symptoms that appeared to be completely natural deaths from various common illnesses. Her poison preparations were so sophisticated that she could control timing, symptoms, and apparent causes of death with precision that allowed her to coordinate eliminations with political or military objectives. Margaret's techniques included slow-acting poisons that could eliminate targets weeks or months after administration, giving her perfect alibis for times when deaths occurred, fast-acting preparations that could eliminate immediate threats during crisis situations, and specialized compounds that could create specific symptoms that would mislead medical investigators about actual causes of death. Surgical warfare techniques allowed skilled medical practitioners to eliminate enemies through procedures that appeared to be legitimate medical treatments but were actually designed to cause fatal complications that would be difficult to detect or prove. These techniques required exceptional surgical skill and detailed understanding of human anatomy that allowed practitioners to cause specific types of damage while maintaining plausible medical explanations for negative outcomes. The surgical techniques included procedures that introduced infections through contaminated instruments or materials, operations that caused internal bleeding that wouldn't be detected until fatal complications developed, and treatments that damaged vital organs in ways that would appear to be medical accidents rather than intentional harm. Sister Joan of Shaftesbury became notorious among her enemies for surgical treatments that appeared successful initially but resulted in fatal complications that developed weeks after procedures were completed, providing her with perfect alibis while eliminating threats to her community's security. Her surgical warfare techniques were so sophisticated that even experienced physicians couldn't determine whether deaths were caused by medical incompetence or intentional harm. Medical intelligence gathering allowed skilled practitioners to learn crucial information about enemies' health conditions, personal habits, and psychological vulnerabilities that could be exploited through various means. Medical consultations provided perfect cover for gathering this intelligence because patients typically provided detailed information about their conditions and lifestyles during diagnosis and treatment processes. The intelligence gathered through medical practice could be used to predict when enemies might be vulnerable to attack, identify health conditions that could be exploited through targeted treatments, and understand personal relationships and political connections that might affect how enemies would respond to various types of pressure. Sister Agnes of Barking used her medical practice to gather detailed intelligence about the health conditions and personal vulnerabilities of multiple political leaders in her region, then used this information to coordinate political and military activities that took advantage of enemies' weaknesses at optimal times for maximum strategic advantage. 20. The Ultimate Survival Master's Comprehensive Power Integration. The most extraordinary medieval nuns eventually developed comprehensive survival systems that integrated all the techniques we've discussed into seamless approaches that could handle virtually any threat while building substantial personal power and community influence that extended far beyond traditional religious boundaries. These ultimate masters combined military strategy, political intelligence, economic warfare, medical expertise, and social manipulation into sophisticated systems that made them among the most powerful individuals of their time. The ultimate survival systems required decades to develop fully and could only be mastered by women who survived long enough to gain experience with all the various types of threats and opportunities that medieval life presented. The most successful masters learned from every crisis and continuously refined their techniques based on practical experience with real dangers and challenges. Abbess Hildegard of Bingen represents perhaps the most complete example of ultimate survival mastery, having developed capabilities that included mystical religious authority, sophisticated medical knowledge, international political influence, economic management expertise, and military strategic thinking that allowed her to exercise power that rivaled kings and emperors across medieval Europe. Hildegard's survival system included religious authority based on mystical visions that provided her with divine legitimacy that was difficult for secular or ecclesiastical authorities to challenge directly, medical expertise that gave her access to powerful individuals who needed her healing services, political intelligence networks that provided advanced warning of threats and opportunities across multiple kingdoms, and economic management capabilities that generated substantial wealth for her religious community. Her mystical authority was particularly sophisticated because it provided her with religious legitimacy that transcended normal ecclesiastical hierarchies while giving her flexibility to interpret divine revelation in ways that supported her political and strategic objectives. Her visions were documented in ways that provided religious justification for virtually any action she might need to take for survival or advancement purposes. The integration of all these capabilities into a single comprehensive system allowed Hildegard to exercise influence that extended across religious, political, economic, and social domains simultaneously. She could use religious authority to influence political decisions, convert political connections into economic opportunities, and leverage economic resources to build military capabilities that provided security for her community and advancement for her personal objectives. Abbess Selina de Clare of Barking Abbey developed another example of comprehensive survival mastery that combined noble birth advantages with sophisticated survival techniques to create power that influenced English politics for decades. Her system integrated family political connections with religious authority, economic expertise with military strategic thinking, and social manipulation with international diplomatic capabilities. Eleanor's noble background provided her with initial advantages that most nuns didn't possess, but her survival techniques went far beyond relying on family connections. She developed independent capabilities in all the areas we've discussed and used them to build power that eventually exceeded what her family connections alone could have provided. Her political intelligence network extended across Europe and provided information that influenced English foreign policy decisions. Her economic warfare techniques helped finance English military campaigns while building wealth for her religious community, and her social manipulation capabilities allowed her to influence court politics in ways that advanced both English national interests and her own community's security. The ultimate survival masters understood that their techniques needed to remain largely secret to be effective, as enemies who understood their methods could develop countermeasures that would neutralize their advantages. They learned to disguise their security and power-building activities as normal religious practices while actually operating sophisticated systems that could handle virtually any threat. Sister Margaret Beaufort, though not technically a nun, demonstrates how women who mastered these survival techniques could eventually transcend all traditional limitations and exercise power that shaped entire kingdoms. Her techniques for surviving multiple political regime changes, building wealth through economic warfare, and manipulating social relationships to advance her son's claim to the English throne show how survival skills could be scaled up to influence national politics. Margaret's survival during the Wars of the Roses required understanding shifting political alliances, managing substantial financial resources, coordinating with international allies, and manipulating social relationships across multiple decades of political instability. Her success in placing her son Henry Tudor on the English throne demonstrates how individual women could use survival techniques to influence the course of European history. The comprehensive systems developed by these ultimate masters provided models that influenced how power was understood and exercised throughout the medieval period and beyond. Their achievements demonstrated that intelligence and strategic thinking could be more effective than traditional military force or inherited authority, and their techniques influenced political development across multiple generations. Their legacy reminds us that survival techniques, when fully developed and strategically applied, can become tools for social transformation that extend far beyond individual benefit to create systemic changes that improve conditions for entire communities and societies. These remarkable women showed us that the greatest victory is not just surviving dangerous circumstances, but using the skills developed through survival challenges to build lasting positive change that benefits future generations. The medieval nuns who mastered these comprehensive survival and power techniques proved that even under the most restrictive and dangerous circumstances, determined individuals could not only survive but could actually transform the systems that sought to limit their possibilities. Their achievements demonstrate the power of human intelligence, determination, and strategic thinking to overcome seemingly impossible obstacles and create lasting positive change that benefits future generations. 21. The mystical weapon Sacred Visions as Ultimate Power. The The most extraordinary medieval nuns discovered that mystical experiences could be transformed into the ultimate form of power, one that even kings and popes had to respect because it claimed direct divine authority. These visionary women understood that in a world where religious authority trumped all other forms of power, claiming direct communication with God provided them with influence that could reshape entire kingdoms and challenge the most powerful men of their era, creating opportunities that would have been impossible through any other means. The development of mystical authority was incredibly dangerous because it required walking a knife's edge between orthodox religious experience and heretical claims that could result in execution for blasphemy. The most successful mystical masters learned to frame the spiritual experiences in ways that supported rather than challenged established religious doctrines, while still providing them with unique sources of authority that transcended normal ecclesiastical hierarchies and created unprecedented opportunities for female influence in medieval society. The psychological sophistication required for successful mystical manipulation was extraordinary, as these women had to understand both the theological frameworks that defined orthodox religious experience and the political dynamics that determined how different types of mystical claims would be received by various audiences. They needed to craft mystical narratives that would be believable to skeptical authorities while providing them with the flexibility to intervene in political situations when circumstances required divine guidance to support their objectives. Hildegard of Bingen represents perhaps the most complete mastery of mystical power as a survival and dominance tool in all of medieval history. Her visions weren't simply personal spiritual experiences, they were carefully crafted political weapons that allowed her to influence emperors, popes, and international conflicts while maintaining the protection that came with religious authority that was virtually impossible for secular or ecclesiastical authorities to challenge directly without appearing to oppose God himself. Hildegard's mystical strategy was particularly sophisticated because it provided her with flexibility to interpret divine revelation in ways that supported her political and strategic objectives while maintaining plausible religious legitimacy. When she needed to oppose a particular political decision, she could claim that God had revealed the correct course of action to her in a detailed vision that provided specific guidance about how political leaders should proceed. When she wanted to support a particular candidate for political office, she could describe divine messages that endorsed her preferred choice while condemning alternatives as contrary to God's will. This mystical authority gave her power that operated outside normal political and religious hierarchies, allowing her to bypass traditional channels of influence while claiming authority that was theoretically superior to any earthly power structure. Her mystical experiences provided religious justification for political interventions that would have been impossible for any secular woman to attempt, while her reputation for divine communication made it dangerous for authorities to ignore her guidance without risking divine displeasure. The physical manifestations that accompanied Hildegard's visions were not just spiritual experiences, but carefully managed theatrical performances that demonstrated the authenticity and power of her divine connections to audiences who needed tangible evidence of supernatural influence. She would experience dramatic physical symptoms during her visions, including intense pain, temporary blindness, apparent loss of consciousness, and convulsive movements that convinced observers that she was truly in contact with supernatural forces rather than simply fabricating claims for political advantage. These physical performances served multiple strategic purposes beyond simply convincing people of her mystical authenticity and divine favor. They provided her with perfect excuses for any political or social mistakes she might make. She could always claim that her human frailty had interfered with divine messages, or that her physical suffering had prevented her from communicating God's will with complete accuracy. They also created dramatic spectacles that attracted attention and built her reputation as a powerful spiritual figure whose influence extended far beyond her individual monastery and religious community. The timing of Hildegard's mystical experiences was precisely coordinated with political developments that required her intervention, suggesting sophisticated understanding of how mystical authority could be deployed strategically to influence specific situations. Her visions often occurred just before major political decisions needed to be made, providing divine guidance that could influence the outcomes of important negotiations or conflicts. This timing was so precise that it suggests careful planning and political intelligence gathering that allowed her to deploy mystical interventions for maximum strategic effect. Mechthild of Magdeburg developed another approach to mystical power that focused on erotic spiritual experiences that challenged traditional gender roles while providing her with unique forms of religious authority that couldn't be replicated or appropriated by male religious figures. Her mystical writings described intimate relationships with Christ that use explicitly sexual language to describe spiritual union, creating religious authority that was specifically feminine and therefore uniquely powerful within medieval religious contexts. Mechthild's erotic mysticism was particularly dangerous because it claimed that women had special spiritual capabilities that made them more suited for certain types of divine communication than men, directly challenging medieval assumptions about female spiritual inferiority while providing her with religious authority that was uniquely feminine and therefore impossible for male competitors to appropriate or duplicate. Her mystical experiences suggested that divine love required feminine receptivity and emotional capacity that men could not provide, making women essential rather than inferior participants in the most profound forms of religious experience. The erotic elements in her mystical experiences also provided her with subtle but powerful forms of sexual agency within a religious system that demanded female celibacy and complete suppression of feminine sexuality. By describing spiritual experiences in sexual terms, she could express and explore sexuality while maintaining religious orthodoxy and even claiming special spiritual authority based on her feminine capacity for divine intimacy that transcended and transformed ordinary physical desires into supernatural spiritual experiences. Her writings created a theological framework that justified female spiritual authority while providing psychological outlets for sexual expression that would otherwise have been completely forbidden within religious contexts. The erotic mysticism allowed her to claim that her feminine nature was not a spiritual liability, but actually provided her with the unique capabilities for experiencing divine love that made her spiritual insights more valuable than those available through traditional masculine approaches to religious experience. Joan of Arc represents the ultimate expression of mystical power as a survival and political tool, using her visions to transform herself from a peasant girl into one of the most powerful political figures in medieval France while demonstrating how mystical authority could be deployed to overcome virtually any social or political barrier when properly managed and strategically applied. Joan's mystical strategy was particularly sophisticated because it combined religious authority with military and political objectives in ways that created unprecedented power for a woman in medieval society while providing religious justification for actions that would otherwise have been impossible for someone of her social background and gender. She claimed that her visions had instructed her to save France from English invasion, providing her with divine mandates that justified military and political actions that transcended all normal social hierarchies and gender limitations. The genius of Joan's approach was that she structured her mystical claims in ways that were impossible to disprove while being specific enough to provide clear courses of action that could be evaluated based on their practical results rather than their theological orthodoxy. When she claimed that her voices had told her to crown the Dauphin at Reims Cathedral, she created a specific political objective that could be achieved through concrete actions whose success or failure would validate or discredit her mystical authority. When she claimed divine instruction to drive the English from French soil, she provided religious justification for military campaigns that served French national interests while creating measurable objectives that could demonstrate the authenticity of her divine guidance through practical results rather than theological arguments. This approach allowed her to build credibility through military and political successes that provided empirical evidence of divine favor rather than relying purely on theological claims that might be disputed by religious authorities. 22. The Knowledge Revolutionaries' Education as Transformative Power. Medieval nuns who understood the transformative power of knowledge created educational systems that went far beyond simple literacy to become comprehensive programs for developing intellectual capabilities that could challenge existing power structures and create new possibilities for women's participation in medieval society while building institutional frameworks that could preserve and transmit advanced knowledge across multiple generations. The most visionary educational revolutionaries understood that knowledge was not just useful for individual advancement, but could be used to transform entire social systems by creating new forms of authority and influence that didn't depend on traditional sources of power like inherited wealth, military force, or family connections. They built educational programs that could produce generations of women with intellectual capabilities that rivaled or exceeded those of the most educated men of their time while maintaining the religious legitimacy that protected their activities from hostile secular and ecclesiastical authorities. The educational systems developed by these knowledge revolutionaries included comprehensive curricula that covered theology, philosophy, natural sciences, medicine, law, literature, mathematics, astronomy, and practical skills like administration and financial management. These programs were designed to produce women who could participate effectively in all aspects of medieval intellectual life while maintaining the religious framework that provided them with protection from authorities who might otherwise view educated women as threats to established social orders. The theological components of these educational programs were particularly sophisticated because they provided women with the intellectual tools necessary for engaging in complex religious debates while maintaining orthodox positions that couldn't be challenged as heretical by hostile authorities. The theological education included detailed study of scripture, church fathers, canon law, and contemporary theological debates that allowed graduates to participate in religious discussions at the highest levels of intellectual sophistication while maintaining the religious legitimacy that protected their other activities. Sister Scholastica of Poitiers developed what may have been the most comprehensive educational program created by medieval nuns, establishing a curriculum that included advanced study in the 7 liberal arts, natural philosophy, medical theory and practice, legal studies, administrative training, and specialized courses that prepared women for leadership roles in religious and secular contexts while maintaining the religious framework that justified their educational activities. Her educational program attracted students from across Europe and produced graduates who went on to establish similar programs in other regions, creating a network of intellectual centers that gradually transformed expectations about women's educational capabilities and social roles while building institutional structures that could preserve and transmit advanced knowledge across multiple generations of women who might otherwise have been excluded from intellectual life. The program's most innovative feature was its integration of theoretical knowledge with practical skills that could be applied immediately to solve real-world problems that affected both religious communities and secular societies. Students learned not just theological theory but practical skills for managing religious communities, resolving conflicts, and providing spiritual guidance that could be applied in various contexts. They studied not just legal theory, but practical experience in conducting legal proceedings, drafting contracts, and navigating complex legal systems that govern medieval society. The medical education component included not just theoretical knowledge about human anatomy and disease processes, but hands-on experience treating patients with various conditions, preparing pharmaceutical compounds, and conducting surgical procedures that provided graduates with practical skills that could be used to support their communities while building reputations that provided them with access to powerful individuals who needed medical care. The library systems created by knowledge revolutionary nuns became centers of intellectual activity that preserved and transmitted knowledge across generations while creating new scholarship that advanced understanding in multiple fields and influenced intellectual development throughout medieval Europe and beyond. These libraries were often more comprehensive and better organized than those maintained by male religious institutions or secular authorities, reflecting the systematic approaches that nun scholars brought to knowledge preservation and the particular attention they paid to maintaining educational resources that could serve multiple generations of students and scholars. Sister Benedict of Regensburg created what may have been the most advanced library system of the medieval period, developing organizational methods that allowed quick access to information across multiple disciplines while maintaining security systems that protected valuable manuscripts from theft, fire, floods, and other threats that could destroy irreplaceable knowledge. Her library became a destination for scholars from across Europe who needed access to rare texts or wanted to consult with the nun scholars who worked there as research specialists. The library's most innovative feature was its systematic approach to knowledge preservation and transmission that included multiple copies of important texts stored in different locations to prevent total loss, translation programs that made works available in multiple languages to serve diverse scholarly communities, comprehensive cataloging systems that allowed researchers to locate relevant materials quickly, and training programs that ensured the skills needed for maintaining the collection would be passed on to future generations of librarian scholars. The research methodologies developed within these library systems influenced scholarly practices throughout medieval Europe and beyond, as the systematic approaches to knowledge organization and preservation that nun scholars developed proved more effective than the ad hoc methods used by many male institutions. The research techniques included cross-referencing systems that allowed scholars to trace ideas across multiple texts, comparative analysis methods that could identify relationships between different intellectual traditions, and documentation standards that preserved not just the content of important works but also information about their historical contexts and influences. The scholarship produced by these educational centers went far beyond simple preservation of existing knowledge to create new understanding in fields ranging from theology and philosophy to natural sciences and medicine, while maintaining the religious frameworks that justified their intellectual activities and protected them from authorities who might otherwise view the scholarship as inappropriate for women. The intellectual work produced by non-scholars often challenged existing assumptions and created new frameworks for understanding complex problems while maintaining orthodox religious positions that couldn't be condemned as heretical. Their scholarship provided new interpretations of religious texts that expanded possibilities for women's religious participation, developed innovative approaches to natural science that advanced understanding of the physical world, and created new methods for legal and administrative analysis that influenced governance practices throughout medieval Europe. Mother Superior Agatha of Toulouse became renowned for her theological scholarship that provided new interpretations of Christian doctrine while maintaining orthodox positions that couldn't be challenged by hostile authorities. Her theological work was so sophisticated that it was cited by male theologians throughout Europe and influenced church policy discussions at the highest levels of ecclesiastical hierarchy, while providing intellectual justifications for expanded roles for women in religious contexts. Her theological innovations were particularly important because they provided intellectual justifications for expanded roles for women in religious and social contexts while maintaining theological orthodoxy that couldn't be condemned as heretical by hostile authorities. Her work demonstrated that careful scholarship could create new possibilities for women's participation in intellectual and religious life without directly challenging established authorities in ways that might provoke hostile reactions or accusations of heresy. 23. The Medical Revolutionaries' Healing as Path to Power. Medieval nuns who mastered medical knowledge discovered that healing skills could be transformed into extraordinary forms of power and influence that crossed all social boundaries and provided them with access to the most powerful individuals in medieval society while creating opportunities for intelligence gathering, political influence, and economic advancement that would have been impossible through any other means. These medical revolutionaries understood that control over life and death through healing knowledge gave them leverage that could be used to influence political decisions, build substantial wealth, create networks of grateful allies who would provide protection and support during dangerous periods, and develop reputations that provided them with access to the highest levels of medieval society regardless of their original social backgrounds or gender limitations. The medical knowledge developed by nun-healers went far beyond the limited understanding available through formal medical education to include sophisticated understanding of human anatomy, disease processes, pharmaceutical preparations, surgical techniques, diagnostic methods, and psychological treatment approaches that often exceeded the capabilities of officially trained physicians while providing them with medical expertise that could be used for both healing and strategic purposes. The comprehensive nature of their medical education reflected the systematic approaches that religious communities brought to knowledge acquisition and the practical necessities of providing healthcare in environments where other medical resources might be unavailable or inadequate for community needs. Their medical training included not just theoretical knowledge but extensive practical experience treating patients with various conditions, which provided them with diagnostic and treatment capabilities that often exceeded those available through university medical education. Sister Marina of Barcelona developed medical expertise that was so advanced that she became the preferred physician for noble families throughout the Iberian Peninsula, treating conditions that other medical practitioners considered hopeless while building a reputation that provided her with extraordinary political influence and financial resources that she used to support her religious community and advance her personal objectives within medieval society. Her medical practice included innovative surgical techniques that she developed through careful observation and systematic experimentation, pharmaceutical preparations that combined traditional herbal knowledge with new discoveries about drug interactions and dosage optimization, diagnostic methods that allowed her to identify diseases before symptoms became apparent to other practitioners, and treatment approaches that addressed both immediate medical needs and underlying health issues that might contribute to future problems. The most remarkable aspect of her medical work was her understanding of the connection between physical health and psychological well-being, which led her to develop comprehensive treatment approaches that address both physical symptoms and underlying emotional or spiritual issues that might be contributing to illness or preventing recovery. This holistic approach to medical care often produced better results than treatments that focused only on physical symptoms while providing her with insights into patients' psychological states that could be used for strategic purposes. Her diagnostic capabilities were particularly sophisticated because they combined medical knowledge with psychological insight and intuitive understanding that allowed her to assess not just physical conditions, but also the emotional and spiritual factors that might be affecting patients' health. This comprehensive diagnostic approach often allowed her to identify health problems that other practitioners missed, while providing her with detailed understanding of patients' personal circumstances that could be valuable for intelligence gathering and strategic planning. The medical schools established by nun healers became centers of medical innovation that advanced understanding of human anatomy, disease processes, and treatment methods, while training new generations of medical practitioners who could continue their work and expand medical knowledge through their own research and clinical experience. These medical schools often provided better education than official medical universities, while maintaining the religious legitimacy that protected them from hostile authorities who might otherwise view women's medical education as inappropriate or threatening to establish professional hierarchies. The medical education programs included both theoretical knowledge and extensive practical experience that prepared graduates to handle complex medical situations while maintaining the religious framework that justified their medical activities. Mother Superior Constantina of Milan established what may have been the most advanced medical school of the medieval period, creating comprehensive programs that combined theoretical knowledge with extensive practical experience in treating patients with various conditions, while maintaining systematic research programs that advanced medical understanding through careful observation and documentation of treatment outcomes. Her school attracted students from across Europe and produced medical practitioners who went on to establish similar programs in other regions, while contributing to the advancement of medical knowledge through their own research and clinical work. The educational program included advanced courses in anatomy, surgery, pharmaceutical preparation, diagnostic techniques, and patient care that provided graduates with medical capabilities that often exceeded those available through traditional medical education. The school's most innovative feature was its systematic approach to medical research that included careful observation of treatment outcomes, detailed documentation of successful techniques, comparative analysis of different treatment approaches, and experimental methods for developing new treatments that could be tested safely and evaluated objectively. This research methodology produced advances in medical understanding that influenced medical practice throughout Europe, while creating new knowledge that enhanced the school's reputation and attracted additional students and resources. The pharmaceutical research conducted by nun healers led to the development of new drugs and treatment methods that were often more effective than those used by officially trained physicians, while providing them with medical capabilities that enhanced their reputations and increased demand for their services. These pharmaceutical innovations included new methods for extracting and concentrating active ingredients from medicinal plants, innovative techniques for combining different substances to create more powerful treatments, systematic approaches to dosage optimization that maximized therapeutic benefits while minimizing harmful side effects, and comprehensive understanding of how different drugs interacted with each other in the human body to produce synergistic or antagonistic effects. Sister Theodora of Vienna became renowned throughout medieval Europe for her pharmaceutical innovations that included new methods for treating plague symptoms that significantly improved survival rates, surgical techniques that reduced infection rates and improved recovery times, pain management methods that allowed patients to recover more quickly from serious injuries, and preventive treatments that could reduce the likelihood of contracting various diseases. Her pharmaceutical work was so advanced that it was studied by medical practitioners throughout Europe and influenced medical education at major universities, while providing her with expertise that made her services invaluable to powerful individuals who needed medical care. Her research methodology included systematic testing of different treatment approaches, careful documentation of results and side effects, collaboration with other medical practitioners to verify her findings, and continuous refinement of her techniques based on clinical experience and patient outcomes. The intelligence gathering capabilities provided by medical practice gave skilled non-healers access to sensitive information about the health conditions, personal circumstances, and future plans of powerful individuals who sought their medical services, while creating opportunities for political influence that would have been impossible through any other means. Medical practice provided perfect cover for intelligence gathering because patients typically share detailed information about their personal circumstances, political relationships, family situations, and future plans during medical consultations when they were seeking treatment for health problems. Skilled medical intelligence operators could learn more about political situations from treating a few key patients than official intelligence services could discover through traditional espionage methods while maintaining the trust and gratitude of their intelligence sources. 24. The economic revolutionaries' commerce as aberration. Medieval nuns who mastered economic principles discovered that commercial success could provide them with independence and influence that transcended all traditional limitations on women's social participation while creating opportunities for political influence, community development, and personal advancement that would have been impossible through any other means available to medieval women. These economic revolutionaries understood that financial power could be more effective than political authority or military force for achieving their objectives while providing them with security that couldn't be taken away by hostile authorities, independence that allowed them to pursue their goals without depending on male protection or support, and influence that could be used to shape political and social development according to their vision and values. The commercial enterprises developed by non-entrepreneurs went far beyond simple craft production or agricultural management to include sophisticated business operations that competed successfully with major commercial organizations while generating substantial profits that could be invested in community development, educational programs, infrastructure improvements, and strategic initiatives that advanced both individual and community objectives within medieval society. The complexity and sophistication of these commercial operations reflected the systematic approaches that religious communities brought to economic activities and the practical necessities of supporting large communities with diverse needs and limited traditional funding sources. Their business development included market analysis, competitive strategies, supply chain management, quality control, customer service, and financial planning that rivaled or exceeded the capabilities of secular commercial organizations. The textile operations established by the Cistercian nuns at Cas became so successful that they effectively controlled war markets across northern Spain, while generating profits that made the convent one of the wealthiest institutions in the region and provided them with economic independence that allowed them to pursue educational, cultural, and political objectives without depending on external funding sources. Their business success allowed them to build elaborate monastery buildings that demonstrated their prosperity and attracted additional supporters, maintain extensive libraries that served as centers of learning for their region, support educational programs that provided advanced training for women who might otherwise have been excluded from intellectual life, and fund strategic initiatives that advanced their community's influence and security within the broader political and social context. The textile business was particularly sophisticated because it integrated all aspects of production from sheep raising and wool processing to fabric manufacturing and international marketing while maintaining quality control standards that ensured their products commanded premium prices in competitive markets. This vertical integration allowed them to control quality at every stage while maximizing profits that could be reinvested in business expansion and community development. The most innovative aspect of their operation was the development of new textile techniques that produced fabrics of superior quality while reducing production costs through improved efficiency and innovative manufacturing processes. These technical innovations gave them competitive advantages that allowed them to dominate markets while building reputations for quality that attracted customers from across Europe and created demand that exceeded their production capacity. Their marketing strategies included brand development that associated their products with religious quality and moral integrity, distribution networks that reached international markets, customer service that built lasting relationships with major buyers, and pricing strategies that maximized profits while maintaining competitive positions in various market segments. The banking operations developed by some convents provided financial services that competed with major banking houses while generating profits that could be used to support community development and individual advancement through sophisticated understanding of international finance, currency exchange, risk management, and investment strategies. These banking operations required comprehensive knowledge of financial markets, legal frameworks, political relationships, and economic trends that affected how financial services were provided and regulated across different regions and political jurisdictions. The banking services included commercial lending, currency exchange, investment management, and financial consulting that served both religious and secular clients while generating substantial profits for their communities. Sister Colomba of Florence established banking operations that that provided financial services across the Mediterranean region while generating profits that made her convent one of the most powerful economic institutions in Italy and provided her community with financial resources that could be used to support educational programs, infrastructure development, and strategic initiatives that advanced their influence and security. Her banking business included international currency exchange that facilitated trade between different regions, commercial lending that supported business development, investment management that generated consistent returns for her community and clients, and financial consulting that helped other organizations manage their resources more effectively while building relationships that provided her with access to sensitive economic and political information. Her banking innovations included new methods for managing credit risk that reduced losses while maintaining profitability, innovative techniques for facilitating international trade that reduced transaction costs and improved efficiency, investment strategies that generated consistent profits while minimizing exposure to economic downturns and political disruptions, and customer service approaches that built lasting relationships with major clients while attracting new business through referrals and reputation. The trading networks established by non-merchants provided them with international connections that could be used for political intelligence gathering, diplomatic communication, and cultural exchange while generating profits that supported community development and individual advancement through sophisticated understanding of international commerce, transportation systems, and market relationships. Mother Superior Benedict of Hamburg developed trading operations that extended from the Baltic Sea to the Mediterranean while building political relationships that provided her community with protection and influence that exceeded what most political institutions could achieve through official diplomatic channels. Her trading network included partnerships with merchant organizations across Europe while maintaining the religious legitimacy that protected her operations from hostile authorities. Her trading innovations included new methods for managing long-distance commerce that reduced risks and improved profitability, innovative techniques for reducing transportation costs and delivery times, relationship-building approaches that created lasting partnerships with commercial organizations throughout Europe, and intelligence-gathering methods that provided her with advance warning of political and economic developments that might affect her business operations and community security. The economic warfare techniques developed by non-entrepreneurs allowed them to eliminate competitors and hostile forces through financial attacks that were more subtle and effective than direct confrontation, while building their own economic power and community security through systematic approaches to market manipulation and competitive strategy. 25. The Transformation Legacy Permanent Social Change. The achievements of medieval nuns who mastered comprehensive survival and power techniques created lasting changes in medieval society that influenced political, economic, social, and religious developments throughout Europe and beyond, while establishing precedents that continued to influence women's possibilities for centuries after their individual deaths, demonstrating that determined individuals could transform the systems that sought to limit their potential. The political transformations achieved by these remarkable women demonstrated that effective leadership could come from unexpected sources and could be based on different types of power and influence than traditional models assumed, while creating new possibilities for women's political participation that challenged fundamental assumptions about gender roles and political authority that had previously defined medieval society. Their success in exercising political authority provided concrete examples that could be cited by later generations of women who sought to expand their own political roles while creating legal and cultural precedents that made it easier for future women to claim political authority and influence. The precedents they established influenced political development throughout the medieval period and beyond, creating foundations that later movements for women's rights could build upon to achieve even greater political influence and social change. The political innovations they developed included new forms of diplomatic communication that bypassed traditional channels, alternative approaches to conflict resolution that emphasized negotiation over military force, and governance techniques that integrated religious authority with secular power in ways that created unprecedented opportunities for women's political participation while maintaining the legitimacy that protected their activities from hostile authorities. The economic innovations developed by non-entrepreneurs created new models for commercial organization and financial management that influenced economic development throughout medieval Europe while demonstrating that women could achieve commercial success when given appropriate opportunities and resources, challenging assumptions about women's business capabilities and economic potential. Their commercial achievements created wealth that could be used to support educational and cultural development while providing economic foundations that allowed religious communities to pursue objectives that wouldn't have been possible without financial independence. The business models they developed often proved more successful than those used by male-dominated commercial organizations, while providing social benefits that pure profit-maximizing businesses couldn't achieve. The economic precedents they established influenced commercial development throughout medieval Europe and beyond, creating new possibilities for women's economic participation while demonstrating alternative approaches to business organization that emphasized community benefit alongside individual profit. Their economic innovations influenced trade practices, financial systems, and commercial law in ways that created lasting changes in how economic activities were organized and regulated. The educational systems they created provided models for women's intellectual development that influenced educational practices throughout the medieval period while preserving and transmitting knowledge across generations in ways that wouldn't have been possible through traditional male-dominated educational institutions. Their educational innovations demonstrated the value of comprehensive intellectual training for women while creating institutional structures that could support continued learning and scholarship across multiple generations. The libraries and schools they established continued to influence intellectual development long after their founders had died, providing educational opportunities that wouldn't have been available otherwise while preserving knowledge that might otherwise have been lost during periods of political and social disruption. The educational precedents they established influenced educational development throughout medieval Europe and beyond, creating new possibilities for women's intellectual participation while demonstrating that women could excel in scholarly pursuits when given appropriate training and opportunities. Their educational achievements influenced university development, scholarly practices, and intellectual culture in ways that created lasting changes in how knowledge was preserved, transmitted, and developed. The medical advances achieved by non-healers influenced medical understanding and practice throughout Europe while demonstrating that women could excel in medical fields when given appropriate training and opportunities, challenging assumptions about women's capabilities in technical and scientific areas while providing healthcare services that improved outcomes for entire communities. The medical schools and treatment methods they developed continued to influence medical practice for centuries while creating healthcare systems that serve populations that might otherwise have had no access to medical care. Their medical innovations often proved more effective than treatments used by officially trained physicians while maintaining the religious legitimacy that protected their activities from professional and political opposition. The medical precedents they established influenced medical education, healthcare organization, and treatment practices throughout medieval Europe and beyond, creating new possibilities for women's participation in medical fields while demonstrating alternative approaches to healthcare that emphasized comprehensive treatment alongside technical expertise. 26. The Master Class Final Lessons from History's Greatest Survivors. The medieval nuns who achieved ultimate mastery of survival techniques created comprehensive systems that integrated all the skills we've explored throughout this series: military strategy, political intelligence, economic warfare, medical expertise, mystical authority, and social manipulation into seamless approaches that could handle virtually any challenge while transforming their individual survival into community transformation and lasting historical change. These were not mere survival tactics, but sophisticated frameworks for wielding power that rivaled anything developed by kings or generals. These master practitioners understood that true survival was never just about avoiding death or destruction, but about using survival challenges as opportunities to build power, influence, and lasting positive change that could benefit future generations while creating systems that could withstand the test of time and continue to provide protection and advancement for their communities long after their individual deaths. They transformed the very concept of survival from a reactive, defensive posture into a proactive strategy for social transformation. The integration of all these survival techniques required decades of experience, exceptional intellectual capabilities, and the psychological strength to maintain multiple complex strategies simultaneously while adapting to changing circumstances and new threats that could emerge without warning from any direction. The most successful masters learned to think systematically about survival, understanding how different techniques could reinforce each other while providing backup systems that could continue functioning even if primary approaches failed or were compromised by hostile forces. The psychological sophistication required for this level of mastery was extraordinary. These women had to maintain the appearance of humble religious devotion while simultaneously operating complex intelligence networks, managing substantial economic enterprises, conducting delicate political negotiations, and sometimes eliminating enemies through methods that would horrify modern observers. The mental compartmentalization required to succeed in this environment while maintaining the sanity and moral compass was a survival skill in itself. Sister Catherine of Siena represents perhaps the most complete example of integrated survival mastery, having developed mystical authority that allowed her to influence papal politics across Europe, political intelligence networks that provided advance warning of threats from multiple kingdoms simultaneously, economic capabilities that generated substantial resources for her community and political operations, medical expertise that gave her access to powerful individuals who might otherwise have been inaccessible, and social manipulation skills that allowed her to build coalitions that could survive major political changes and continue advancing her objectives. Her mystical experiences provided her with religious authority that was virtually impossible to challenge directly without appearing to oppose God himself, while her political intelligence gathering allowed her to time her mystical interventions for maximum strategic effect when political decisions needed divine guidance. Her economic activities generated the resources necessary to support her political operations, including funding for messengers, bribes for officials, and resources for allies who supported her objectives. Her medical practice provided perfect cover for intelligence gathering and relationship building with powerful individuals who might otherwise have been suspicious of her motivations. Patients typically share detailed information about their personal circumstances, political relationships, and future plans during medical consultations, giving her access to sensitive information that would have been impossible to obtain through other means. The integration of all these capabilities into a single comprehensive system allowed her to exercise influence that extended across religious, political, and social domains simultaneously while maintaining the protection that came from religious legitimacy and the flexibility that came from having multiple independent sources of power that couldn't all be attacked or eliminated simultaneously by hostile forces. Abbess Gertrude of Nivelles developed another example of comprehensive mastery that combined noble birth advantages with sophisticated survival techniques to create power that influenced political developments across multiple kingdoms while establishing educational and cultural institutions that continued to advance women's capabilities and opportunities long after her death. Her approach emphasized the crucial importance of building institutional frameworks that could preserve and transmit survival knowledge across generations rather than depending entirely on individual capabilities that would be lost when particular leaders died or became unavailable. Her comprehensive system included military alliances that provided physical protection through treaties with multiple noble families, economic enterprises that generated financial independence through diversified business operations, educational programs that developed human capabilities through systematic training and knowledge preservation, and political relationships that provided influence and early warning about developing threats through carefully cultivated intelligence networks that extended across international boundaries. The most sophisticated aspect of her approach was her understanding that survival systems needed to be sustainable across multiple generations rather than dependent on individual capabilities that would be lost when particular leaders died or became unavailable for community leadership. She created comprehensive training programs that could transmit crucial skills to successors, detailed documentation systems that preserved important knowledge and procedures in written form that could survive political upheavals, and institutional structures that could adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining core capabilities that were essential for community survival and advancement. Her legacy included not just the immediate protection and advancement of her own community, but the creation of models and precedents that influenced how other religious communities approached survival challenges throughout medieval Europe and beyond. The techniques she developed were studied and adapted by other abbesses who faced similar challenges, creating networks of knowledge sharing that multiplied the effectiveness of individual innovations across entire regions. 27. The Advanced Integration Techniques Multi-Domain Mastery. The most sophisticated medieval nuns understood that true security required mastering multiple domains simultaneously rather than specializing in single areas that might prove inadequate when circumstances changed or new threats emerged from unexpected directions. They developed comprehensive approaches that integrated spiritual authority, intellectual capabilities, economic resources, political influence, and social networks into seamless systems that could adapt to any challenge while maintaining multiple backup options for continued effectiveness. This multi-domain mastery required understanding how different types of power and influence interacted with each other and could be combined for maximum effectiveness while avoiding conflicts or contradictions that might undermine overall strategies. The most successful practitioners learned to coordinate activities across multiple domains while maintaining security and avoiding detection by hostile forces who might attempt to disrupt their operations if they understood their full scope and sophistication. The spiritual domain provided legitimacy and protection that was crucial for all other activities, as religious authority in medieval society trumped most other forms of power and provided protection from accusations of inappropriate behavior that might otherwise destroy women who wielded substantial influence. Mystical experiences, theological expertise, and reputation for holiness created foundations that justified and protected other activities while providing unique sources of authority that couldn't be replicated by secular competitors. The intellectual domain provided the analytical capabilities necessary for understanding complex situations, developing effective strategies, and making decisions that could affect entire communities' survival and advancement. Advanced education, research capabilities, and systematic approaches to knowledge acquisition and application created competitive advantages that allowed non-leaders to think and outmaneuver opponents who relied on traditional approaches or limited understanding. The economic domain provided the resources necessary to support all other activities while creating independence that protected communities from external control and manipulation. Sophisticated business operations, financial management, and economic warfare capabilities generated wealth that could be used to support political operations, fund military preparations, and provide security during crisis periods when other resources might be unavailable. The political domain provided influence and protection through relationships with secular and ecclesiastical authorities who could provide support during crisis periods or prevent hostile actions that might threaten community survival. Intelligence networks, diplomatic capabilities, and strategic alliance building created political resources that could be activated when circumstances require external intervention or support. The social domain provided networks of mutual support and protection that could survive individual disasters while creating opportunities for advancement through collective action and resource sharing. Relationship building, reputation management, and community organizing capabilities created social capital that could be converted into other forms of power when circumstances required different approaches to achieving objectives. 28. The crisis management protocols handling multiple simultaneous threats. Medieval nuns who achieved ultimate survival mastery developed sophisticated protocols for handling multiple simultaneous threats that could overwhelm communities that relied on single response approaches or reactive strategies rather than comprehensive planning and systematic preparation for various crisis scenarios. These crisis management systems required understanding how different types of threats might interact with each other and compound dangers in ways that could create catastrophic failures if not properly anticipated and prepared for in advance. Military threats might coincide with economic crises, political upheavals could trigger social conflicts, and natural disasters might occur during periods when communities were already vulnerable due to other challenges. The most effective crisis management protocols included early warning systems that could detect developing threats before they became immediate dangers, allowing time for preparation and response that might prevent crises from occurring or minimize their impact when they couldn't be avoided entirely. These warning systems required intelligence networks that could gather information from multiple sources, analysis capabilities that could interpret complex information and identify patterns that indicated developing threat, and communication systems that could rapidly disseminate warnings and coordinate responses. Resource management during crisis periods required maintaining emergency stockpiles that could sustain communities during extended periods when normal supply chains might be disrupted, establishing alternative sources for essential resources that could be activated when primary sources became unavailable, and developing rationing systems that could fairly distribute limited resources while maintaining community morale and cooperation during difficult periods. Communication protocols during emergencies required backup systems that could function when primary communication methods were compromised or unavailable, secure methods for transmitting sensitive information that couldn't be intercepted by hostile forces, and clear command structures that could maintain coordination even when normal leadership might be unavailable due to casualties or other crisis-related disruptions. Evacuation procedures required predetermined plans that could be implemented rapidly when staying in place became too dangerous, alternative locations where communities could relocate temporarily while threats persisted, and methods for preserving essential resources and information that would be needed for rebuilding after crises passed and normal operations could resume. Recovery planning required systematic approaches to rebuilding that could restore community capabilities as quickly as possible after crisis periods ended, methods for learning from crisis experiences and improving future preparedness based on lessons learned during actual emergency situations, and strategies for strengthening community resilience that could better withstand future threats and challenges. 29. The knowledge preservation systems ensuring continuity across generations. Medieval nuns who understood the importance of institutional continuity developed sophisticated systems for preserving and transmitting crucial knowledge across generations, understanding that individual survival was meaningless if the knowledge and capabilities that made survival possible died with particular leaders or were lost during crisis periods that disrupted normal community operations. These knowledge preservation systems required comprehensive documentation that recorded not just what techniques were effective, but also how they were implemented, when they were most appropriate, and what conditions were necessary for their successful application. The documentation had to be detailed enough that future leaders could understand and apply the techniques even if they hadn't learned them through direct experience or mentorship from original developers. The training programs developed by master nuns included both theoretical education that provided understanding of underlying principles and practical experience that developed the skills necessary for effective implementation. These programs required careful selection and development of successors who had the intellectual capabilities, psychological strength, and ethical foundations necessary to handle the responsibilities that came with advanced survival knowledge and the power it provided. Succession planning required identifying and preparing multiple potential leaders rather than relying on single successors who might become unavailable due to death, illness, or other circumstances that could leave communities without experienced leadership during crucial periods. The most sophisticated succession systems included cross-training that ensured multiple community members understood each crucial function, preventing single points of failure that could destroy entire systems if key individuals became unavailable. Quality control systems ensured that knowledge transmission maintained accuracy and effectiveness across generations rather than gradually degrading through misunderstanding or incomplete learning that could render techniques effective or even dangerous when applied incorrectly. These systems require regular testing and evaluation of techniques, feedback mechanisms that could identify problems before they became serious, and correction procedures that could restore effectiveness when problems were discovered. Adaptation mechanisms allowed preserved knowledge to evolve and improve based on changing circumstances and new discoveries rather than becoming obsolete due to rigid adherence to historical practices that might no longer be appropriate for current conditions. The most effective preservation systems maintained core principles while allowing flexibility in implementation that could accommodate new threats, opportunities, and technological developments. 30. The modern application's ancient wisdom for contemporary challenges. The survival techniques developed by medieval nuns remain remarkably relevant for modern people facing their own versions of hostile environments, limited resources, systemic discrimination, and seemingly impossible circumstances that require creative solutions and strategic thinking to overcome successfully while building better futures for themselves and their communities. The fundamental challenges that medieval nuns faced surviving in hostile environments where they had limited formal power, building influence despite systemic discrimination, creating economic independence without traditional advantages, developing skills that could provide security and advancement, and transforming survival challenges into opportunities for positive change are strikingly similar to challenges that many people face in contemporary society, whether in corporate environments, political systems, or social contexts. The strategic principles they develop remain as relevant today as they were 8 centuries ago for anyone seeking to overcome seemingly impossible circumstances through intelligence, determination, and systematic approaches to problem solving. These principles include the importance of building multiple independent sources of security and influence rather than depending on single approaches that might fail when circumstances change, the value of developing diverse skill sets that can be adapted to different situations and opportunities, and the necessity of creating networks of mutual support and protection that can provide resilience during difficult periods. Modern professionals can learn from the economic warfare techniques that medieval nuns used to build wealth and eliminate competitors. Understanding how market analysis, competitive strategy, resource management, and strategic partnerships can be developed and deployed in contemporary business environments while maintaining ethical standards and legal compliance that provide protection from hostile responses and regulatory problems. The intelligence gathering and analysis techniques that medieval nuns developed can be adapted for contemporary contexts where information management, relationship building, strategic timing, and coalition formation are crucial for success in competitive environments. Understanding how to gather accurate information, analyze complex situations, and make strategic decisions based on incomplete information remains as important today as it was in medieval times. Contemporary activists and social change agents can study the political techniques that medieval nuns used to influence powerful individuals and shape social attitudes. Understanding how personal branding, moral authority, strategic communication, and coalition building can be used to create positive change while avoiding the mistakes that could destroy movements before they achieve their objectives. The educational strategies that medieval nuns developed for building knowledge and capabilities remain relevant for modern students and professionals who need to develop skills that can provide security and advancement in rapidly changing economic and social environments where traditional career paths may no longer provide reliable opportunities for success and advancement. The medical and healing approaches that medieval nuns pioneered can inform contemporary healthcare providers who seek to provide comprehensive care that addresses not just physical symptoms but also emotional, social, and spiritual aspects of health and well-being that affect overall outcomes and quality of life. 31. The psychological mastery, mental resilience, and emotional intelligence. The psychological techniques that medieval nuns developed to maintain mental health and emotional stability during extended periods of stress, uncertainty, and danger remain remarkably relevant for contemporary individuals who face their own versions of challenging circumstances that require exceptional mental resilience and emotional intelligence to navigate successfully. These psychological techniques included methods for maintaining hope and motivation during seemingly impossible circumstances, strategies for managing fear and anxiety that could otherwise paralyze decision-making and action, and approaches to building confidence and self-efficacy that could sustain efforts over long periods when results might not be immediately visible or encouraging. The mental compartmentalization techniques that medieval nuns used to maintain their psychological stability while simultaneously managing multiple complex responsibilities and relationships required exceptional emotional intelligence and self-awareness. They learned to separate different aspects of their lives and responsibilities so that problems in one area wouldn't contaminate their effectiveness in other domains, while still maintaining integration and coordination across all their activities. Stress management techniques included systematic approaches to physical and mental self-care that could maintain health and effectiveness during periods of intense pressure and demanding circumstances. These approaches recognized the connection between physical health and mental performance, understanding that neglecting basic health needs could undermine all other survival efforts and strategic objectives. Emotional regulation techniques allowed medieval nuns to maintain appropriate responses to various situations while preventing emotions from interfering with strategic thinking and decision-making processes. They learned to use emotions as information about situations while not allowing emotional reactions to control their responses or limit their strategic options. Relationship management skills included understanding how to build and maintain trust with various types of people, how to navigate conflicts without creating unnecessary enemies, and how to influence others through persuasion rather than manipulation or coercion that might create resentment and opposition. Communication skills included understanding how to convey information effectively to different audiences, how to maintain secrecy when necessary for security reasons, and how to use language strategically to achieve specific objectives while maintaining relationships and avoiding unnecessary conflicts. 32. The ethical framework, moral foundations for survival strategies. One of the most remarkable aspects of medieval non-survival strategies was how they managed to maintain ethical foundations while developing and implementing techniques that might otherwise have been considered morally questionable if used purely for personal advantage rather than community protection and advancement. The ethical frameworks that medieval nuns developed provided moral justifications for activities that might otherwise have been condemned as inappropriate or immoral, understanding that survival often required actions that might seem contradictory to religious teachings if viewed in isolation rather than within a context of protecting entire communities and advancing positive social change. Their approach to ethical decision-making recognized that absolute moral rules might sometimes conflict with each other in complex real-world situations, requiring careful analysis and judgment about which principle should take precedence when perfect solutions weren't available and all alternatives involved some form of moral compromise. The protection of community principle justified actions that might harm individuals if those actions were necessary to protect larger numbers of people or prevent greater harms that would result from inaction or adherence to abstract principles that ignore practical consequences and real-world impacts. The greater good principle allowed medieval nuns to make strategic decisions that might involve short-term costs or compromises if those decisions would create long-term benefits that outweighed immediate negative consequences and contributed to positive social transformation that wouldn't otherwise be possible. The proportionality principle required that any questionable actions be proportionate to the threats they were designed to address, ensuring that responses weren't excessive or cruel beyond what was necessary to achieve legitimate defensive or protective objectives. The last resort principle meant that questionable tactics should only be used when other alternatives had been exhausted or were clearly inadequate for addressing serious threats that couldn't be handled through more conventional or obviously moral approaches. The accountability principle required that decisions be made through careful consideration and consultation with trusted advisors rather than impulsive reactions or personal preferences that might reflect self-interest rather than genuine community needs and long-term strategic objectives. 33. The innovation legacy: how medieval techniques influenced modern systems. The innovative approaches that medieval nuns developed for survival and advancement have influenced countless aspects of contemporary society in ways that most people never recognize or understand, creating foundations for modern systems of education, healthcare, business organization, political activism, and social change that continue to shape how we approach complex challenges. The educational systems that medieval nuns created provided models for comprehensive intellectual development that influenced the evolution of universities, professional training programs, and continuing education systems that recognize the importance of combining theoretical knowledge with practical skills and real-world application. Their approaches to knowledge preservation and transmission influenced the development of modern library systems, documentation standards, and information management practices that ensure crucial knowledge can be maintained and accessed across generations and organizational changes. The healthcare innovations that medieval nuns developed influenced the evolution of modern medical education, patient care practices, and healthcare organization systems that recognize the importance of addressing physical, emotional, and social aspects of health and well-being. Their approaches to pharmaceutical research and development influence modern drug discovery processes, safety testing protocols, and quality control standards that ensure medications are effective and safe for human use while continuing to advance medical knowledge through systematic research and experimentation. The economic strategies that medieval nuns developed influenced modern approaches to cooperative enterprises, social entrepreneurship, and community development that prioritize sustainable value creation alongside individual advancement and profit maximization. Their business organization techniques influenced modern management practices, strategic planning processes, and organizational development approaches that recognize the importance of building resilient systems that can adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining core capabilities and objectives. The political techniques that medieval nuns developed influenced modern approaches to grassroots organizing, coalition building, and advocacy campaigns that seek to create positive social change through strategic communication, relationship building, and systematic approaches to influencing decision-makers and public opinion. The intelligence gathering and analysis techniques influence modern approaches to strategic planning, competitive analysis, and decision-making processes that require understanding complex situations and predicting likely outcomes based on incomplete information and changing circumstances. 34. The ultimate survival wisdom: timeless principles for eternal application. The deepest wisdom that emerges from studying medieval non-survival techniques is the understanding that true security comes not from avoiding challenges or depending on external protection, but from developing comprehensive capabilities that can adapt to changing circumstances while building systems of mutual support that can provide resilience during difficult periods and opportunities for advancement during favorable conditions. The medieval nuns who achieved ultimate survival mastery understood that individual survival was inseparable from community survival, and that the most effective survival strategies were those that created positive outcomes for entire communities rather than just protecting individual interests at the expense of others who might then become enemies or sources of future threats and complications. They demonstrated that survival challenges, when approached strategically and systematically, can become opportunities for developing capabilities, building relationships, and creating positive changes that wouldn't have been possible under more comfortable circumstances that didn't require creative solutions and comprehensive approaches to complex problems. The harsh realities they faced forced them to develop innovative solutions and integrated approaches that proved more effective than traditional methods that relied on inherited advantages, external protection, or simple reactive responses to threats and challenges as they emerged. Their example shows us that the most sustainable survival strategies are those that create value for others while building personal security and advancement, understanding that lasting success comes from building systems of mutual benefit rather than zero-sum competition that eventually creates hostile responses and unsustainable situations that undermine long-term security and prosperity. The integration of spiritual, intellectual, economic, political, and social approaches that medieval nuns achieved demonstrates the importance of developing multiple types of capabilities rather than relying on single approaches that may be effective in some circumstances but vulnerable in others, providing lessons for contemporary individuals who need to build resilience in uncertain and rapidly changing environments. Their success in transforming survival challenges into opportunities for positive social change provides inspiration for modern people who face their own versions of systematic discrimination, limited opportunities, and hostile environments, showing that determined individuals can not only survive but can actually improve conditions for themselves and others through strategic thinking and sustained effort. The techniques they developed remain relevant because they address fundamental human challenges that transcend historical periods: how to survive in hostile environments, how to build power from positions of apparent powerlessness, how to create positive change within restrictive systems, and how to leave lasting legacies that benefit future generations and create better conditions for those who come after us. 35. The final testament from survival to transformation. The ultimate lesson for medieval non-survival techniques is that the highest form of success is not just surviving dangerous circumstances or achieving personal security and advancement, but using the capabilities developed through survival challenges to create lasting positive change that benefits future generations while building systems that can continue to provide opportunities and protection long after individual contributions have ended and original creators are no longer available to provide guidance and leadership. The medieval nuns who achieved this level of impact understood that their individual survival was part of a larger historical process of social transformation that required sustained effort across multiple generations, and that their role was to contribute to positive changes that would outlast their individual lives while providing foundations that others could build upon to achieve even greater advances and improvements in human conditions and opportunities. They demonstrated that survival techniques, when fully developed and strategically applied with long-term vision and ethical foundations, can become tools for social transformation that extend far beyond individual benefit to create systemic changes that improve conditions for entire communities and societies while establishing precedents that influence historical development across centuries and cultural boundaries. Their legacy reminds us that we each have the opportunity to use our own survival challenges as foundations for building positive changes that can benefit others, whether through developing capabilities that we can share with others, creating resources that we can contribute to common causes, building relationships that we can leverage for mutual benefit and collective advancement, or simply providing examples that can inspire and guide others who face similar challenges and seek to overcome seemingly impossible circumstances. The medieval nuns who mastered comprehensive survival techniques proved that even under the most restrictive and dangerous circumstances, determined individuals can not only survive but can actually transform the systems that seek to limit their possibilities, creating lasting positive changes that demonstrate the power of human intelligence, determination, strategic thinking, and ethical commitment to overcome seemingly impossible obstacles and create better futures for subsequent generations. Their example continues to inspire anyone who refuses to accept limitations that others try to impose on their possibilities for growth and achievement, showing that survival is not just about avoiding destruction, but about using survival experiences as foundations for building a better world for those who come after us, while creating legacies that can continue to provide guidance and inspiration across generations. The techniques they developed, building multiple sources of security and influence, developing diverse capabilities that can adapt to changing circumstances, creating networks of mutual support and protection, using information strategically to understand and influence complex situations, maintaining long-term perspectives while handling immediate challenges, and integrating spiritual, intellectual, practical, and social approaches into comprehensive systems remain as relevant today as they were centuries ago for anyone who seeks to transform survival challenges into opportunities for positive change and lasting impact. The stories remind us that history is shaped not just by those who inherit power and privilege, but by those who develop the intelligence, determination, and strategic capabilities necessary to create positive change despite facing seemingly impossible circumstances, proving that individual actions can have lasting historical impact when they are guided by comprehensive understanding, ethical foundations, and sustained commitment to creating better futures for those who will inherit the world we leave behind. The extraordinary survival strategies of medieval nuns represent far more than historical curiosities. They provide a comprehensive masterclass in transforming impossible circumstances into opportunities for lasting positive change that continues to influence how we approach challenges in a modern world. These remarkable women developed techniques for overcoming systemic discrimination, building power from positions of apparent powerlessness, creating economic independence through innovative approaches, developing comprehensive skill sets that could adapt to any challenge, and transforming individual survival into community advancement that benefited entire societies and established precedents that influenced historical development for centuries. Their legacy demonstrates that true mastery comes not from avoiding challenges but from developing the capabilities necessary to transform challenges into opportunities while building systems that can provide security, advancement, and positive change for entire communities across multiple generations. The principles they developed: systematic thinking, comprehensive preparation, ethical foundations, community focus, long-term vision, and integrated approaches that combine multiple types of capabilities remain as relevant today as they were 8 centuries ago for anyone seeking to overcome challenging circumstances while creating positive change that extends beyond individual benefit. If you found these comprehensive survival strategies as fascinating and relevant as I did, there's an incredible universe of medieval wisdom waiting to be explored. These nuns were just one example of the extraordinary people who developed ingenious techniques for not just surviving but thriving and transforming the medieval world through intelligence, determination, and strategic thinking. Make sure to subscribe to my channel for daily medieval content that uncovers the hidden wisdom of our fascinating past. Every single day, I share new discoveries about medieval survival techniques, political strategies, economic innovations, social transformations, and individual stories of people who refused to accept the limitations that others tried to impose on their possibilities for achievement and positive change. From the secret intelligence networks that shaped international politics to the financial innovations that created new forms of economic organization, from the educational systems that preserved and advanced human knowledge to the medical techniques that saved countless lives, from the spiritual innovations that expanded human potential to the social movements that created lasting positive change, there's an endless treasure trove of medieval wisdom that provides practical guidance for contemporary challenges while inspiring us with examples of human capability and achievement. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss the daily medieval content that reveals the incredible ingenuity, resilience, and transformative power of our medieval ancestors. Whether you're interested in survival strategies, political techniques, economic innovations, educational approaches, spiritual practices, or simply incredible stories of people who achieved the impossible through intelligence and determination, there's something new and inspiring every single day. Your subscription helps support this important work of preserving and sharing medieval wisdom while building a community of people who appreciate the complexity, relevance, and enduring value of historical knowledge for contemporary challenges and opportunities. Together, we're creating a resource that can provide guidance, inspiration, and practical techniques for anyone seeking to transform their own challenges into opportunities for positive change and lasting impact. Subscribe today for your daily dose of medieval wisdom, inspiration, and practical guidance for transforming challenges into opportunities for positive change that can benefit not just yourself but entire communities and future generations. The medieval masters await, and their wisdom is more relevant than ever for anyone seeking to create positive change in an uncertain world.